просим разобраться в данной ситуации. Нам был дан приказ командирам роты.
Vladimir Putin is no longer fighting only on the front lines, but also against betrayal within his own ranks. Beyond the trenches, another front has opened, where trust has collapsed and loyalty has been shattered. Russian soldiers are secretly communicating with Ukraine, leaking coordinates and even targeting their own commanders.
Pokrovsk is being surrounded by the Russians. The Russians have been losing more than 1,000 troops a day. All of this is setting the conditions for what's happening at the strategic level. And if the strategic level doesn't work, the operational level doesn't work.
Putin is going through the darkest days of the year, because the summer offensive he had been planning for a long time ended in a major defeat. Moreover, that's not all. The Russian army was forced to face a heavy Ukrainian counterattack. Could this be a sign that the army is rotting from within? Ukrainian front commander Alexander Syrskyi has ordered a tightening of defenses, particularly along the Kamianske line, in response to increasing pressure from Russia. In accordance with this order, the 210th Separate Assault Regiment and the 118th Separate Mechanized Brigade have launched active counterattacks along the defense line extending to the Orikhiv region. Ukrainian troops are not only defending their positions, but also exerting constant pressure to halt the Russian advance. But amid these clashes, another front has opened that could influence the fate of the war. The psychological and intelligence fronts are more active. A Russian soldier belonging to the 57th Separate Brigade in the Zaporizhia region secretly reported the location of his unit's camouflage T-62 tanks to Ukrainian forces. Shortly after these coordinates were relayed, the tanks were targeted and destroyed. The tanks were destroyed not only physically, but also as symbols of the Russian army's morale. This is not an isolated case. Numerous reports from the front lines in recent weeks indicate an increase in similar tip-offs. Ukrainian intelligence sources report that some Russian soldiers have begun sharing coordinates of troop movements, armored formations, ammunition depots, and even temporary command centers with the Ukrainian side. This trend is even more pronounced among soldiers newly deployed to the front lines. Some are resorting to sabotage, jamming radio signals, deliberately damaging equipment, or revealing the locations of their positions before surrendering.
Алло. Здравствуйте.
Добрый день.
Это Украина?
Да, это Украина.
СМС-ка пришла, если хотите сдаться, сможете позвонить.
Да, если хотите сдаться.
Western intelligence sources classify regular data leaks from within the Russian army as of the second quarter of 2025 under 5 main headings. These leaks are no longer random, they are disciplined, systematic, and at a level that will affect the fate of the war. The first heading is location data. The coordinates of armored units, artillery batteries, radar stations, and ammunition depots located behind the front lines are being directly transmitted. These GPS or GLONASS-supported locations significantly improve the targeting accuracy of Ukrainian artillery. Now, a Smerch battery is no longer hit approximately, but precisely. The second category consists of planning schedules. Details of defensive fortifications, troop rotation timelines, and position changes prepared within the command structure are leaked as PDF files or direct photographs of command boards. These documents hold not only military but also psychological value. Ukraine knows in advance when and where the opposing side is vulnerable. The third stream focuses on logistics logs. In particular, the barrel numbers of fuel convoys, the routes of transport vehicles, their transit times, and tables detailing daily ammunition consumption rates of units are directly reaching Western centers. This is invaluable data not only for attacks, but also for a wear and tear strategy. The fourth and more internal area is morale reports. Complaints sent by soldiers to their commanders, lists of dead and wounded within units, correspondence showing delays in salary payments, and frontline reports paint a detailed picture of the mood at the front. This information is critical in both propaganda warfare and psychological operations. The fifth and most dramatic heading is sabotage. Information is no longer just flowing. Actual sabotage is also being carried out from within. Some soldiers jam their own radios, while others remove the fuses from anti-tank mines. Some guns have internal barrel defects.
на одного человека. Это статья 222 Уголовного кодекса Российской.
And deliberately created recoil problems. These actions show that the war is being fought not only on the external front, but also on the internal front. 60% of this extensive data flow goes directly to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense's special encrypted telegram bot called Surrender Hotline. 25% is transferred to joint signal intelligence centers of the United States and the United Kingdom. The remaining 15% reaches Western media directly through various channels. 2 consecutive blows have not only shattered the Russian army's will to fight, but also swept away Putin's current grip on power. Before the critical Alaska meeting, Putin had attempted a sudden attack on the Pokrovsk front. The Russian offensive, which began on August 12th, was completely crushed. In just 2 days, the Russian army suffered a heavy defeat in a major offensive. Now, the breakthrough that Russian President Vladimir Putin was hoping for on the Donbas front has not materialized. Moreover, this failure was a harbinger of the storm to come. The side that suffers defeat in a counterattack is doomed to face a counterattack from the enemy. That is exactly what happened. When the Russians' major Donbas offensive ended in disaster, Ukraine launched a heavy counterattack. The Pokrovsk front was cleared of Russian troops. Azov units and many other Ukrainian brigades recaptured 6 settlements in Donetsk. These are Gruzskoye, Rubizhne, Novovodiyane, Petrovka, Veseloye, and Zolotoy Kolodets. The recapture of these settlements completely shattered Russia's occupation plan in Donbas, and the territorial gains became concrete evidence of this collapse. So why didn't Russia's plan work this time? The answer lies not in where and how the troops were deployed, nor in which intersections were controlled by whom, but in when and by whom the urban cleanup was carried out. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that they had achieved results on the 2 most difficult fronts, Dobropilya and Pokrovsk, for 2 days in a row. In his message, Zelensky said that he had listened to the report from Chief of General Staff Alexander Syrskyi and that the front line was generally holding. In the same statement, Mr. Zelensky mentioned the 1st Azov Corps, the 7th Airborne Corps, the 38th Separate Marine Brigade named after Hetman Petro Sahadarkny, and the 93rd Separate Mechanized Holodny Yar Brigade. He also emphasized that the prisoner stockpile, which he referred to as the exchange pool, had grown. These statements seem to summarize the division of labor on the ground and the search for psychological balance. The statement continued with a table showing personnel and equipment losses between August 4th and 16. The table listed the number of those who did not return, separately noted the number of medically evacuated wounded, and recorded the number of prisoners. On one end of the bridge, there was the Azov settlement cleanup. On the other end, there was the Airborne Forces urban search operation. Why did these 2 ends come together in the same file? Because what disrupted Russia's plan was the closure of the corridors and the inability to establish a withdrawal order. Azov and neighboring units, meanwhile, quickly cleared 6 settlements along the Pokrovsk axis. This clearance operation created a system that closed infiltration channels and kept side roads under fire. A brief assessment converted the impact of this system into numbers. Within a few days, 271 Russian soldiers were neutralized. 101 Russian soldiers were wounded. 13 soldiers were taken prisoner. 1 Russian tank, 2 armored vehicles, 3 artillery systems, and 37 vehicles motorcycles were destroyed or severely damaged. This package alone demonstrates that the corridors used by Russian forces in Donetsk have been closed, and that attempting to reopen them would come at a high cost. The source of this package is also clear. Open source reports and announcements from the field shared the same list. Global media data reported that the Ukrainian army's penetration of Russian lines had extended from 10 kilometers to 23 kilometers. These successive developments have put the Russian army in a truly tragic position in the region. Another breaking point in the collapse of Russia's offensive plan in Donbas, particularly in the Donetsk region, was the capture of prisoners. The accounts of 3 Russian soldiers captured in the Pokrovsk direction provided stark evidence of the nature of the attack. According to the accounts, at least 70% of Russian troops advancing through forest strips during the approach were unable to retreat. This percentage represents the total of those eliminated, the majority of the wounded, and those who surrendered. The pattern relied on pushing forward at any cost, with small assault groups. This pattern collapsed under the combined effects of drone reconnaissance, adjusted artillery fire, and close-range anti-armor effects. A withdrawal order could not be established. The same group that had advanced was caught in fire again before it could regroup. This is why the figure of 70% prisoners is significant. It not only indicates the magnitude of the loss, but also that the path to retreat is closed. So, has Russia's insistence on Pokrovsk come to an end due to these circumstances? Putin is a stubborn leader who enjoys making mistakes. The Russian High Military Command is just like Putin. For this reason, the Russians have not given up on suffering losses in Pokrovsk and trying to gain something from this region. The Russian side has deployed more than 110,000 military personnel to this axis. Russia's goal was to adapt better to the region and gain the upper hand in the clashes by outnumbering the enemy. The fighting has intensified 10 to 15 kilometers north of Pokrovsk. The 51st Combined Arms Army has been reinforced by the 37th Independent Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 68th Army Corps of the Russian Federation. This reinforcement has turned into some suicidal attempts in certain areas. Behind all this pressure was Russia's political calendar-driven quest for a showcase. Following the Alaska talks, the Russian side was likely seeking a positive outcome. However, the recent performance of Russian forces on the Donbas front lines ended fatally in the Dobropilya region. The analogy of main arteries being cut off found its place in the narrative of this battlefield. The process was concluded with the clearing of forest strips and intermediate locations. The protrusion that grew with deep state warnings turned into a closed file within a few days. This series widened the gap between the plan and the reality on the ground. What is the reason behind this betrayal? It is difficult to explain the process leading Russian soldiers to turn their backs on their commanders and their state with a single reason. But behind the cracks on the front lines, 5 fundamental factors stand out. The first factor is a lack of trust in the chain of command. Since the harsh winter of 2024, at least 8 regional commanders have been dismissed. Although the official reasons given are corruption or military indiscipline, the reaction on the front lines is different. Officers believe that the chain of command is no longer shaped by the demands of war, but by political balances in Moscow. The perception that orders are political rather than military in nature is eroding trust in the command structure. The second factor is a logistics and resource crisis. By the summer of 2025, ammunition and fuel supplies had caused serious disruptions on the front lines. Starting in June, some units were reported to have been without artillery support for an average of 4 to 6 hours a day. In a war where their own artillery is silent and fuel supplies are delayed, the soldiers' morale is rapidly declining. What often comes at the expected time of support is only silence. Mobilization fatigue also triggers betrayal. Most of the new soldiers sent to the front with the third wave of mobilization were conscripted without the slightest idea of the nature of the war. Sent directly into combat after less than 2 months of accelerated training, these soldiers' perception of reality is based on short videos they watch on social media. The conflicting content they are exposed to on social media platforms triggers a reflex of questioning rather than propaganda. We must also mention the climate of conspiracy and fear. Disciplinary processes within the Russian army feed the perception that they are being sacrificed on the front lines. By mid-2025, over 1,000 soldiers had been brought to court on charges of insubordination and desertion. These trials have become a kind of warning, especially for those serving on the front lines. A soldier who sees his own officer arrested simply for opposing him now fears not only the enemy, but also the system itself. Finally, family pressure and insecurity are also fueling betrayal. Despite social media restrictions, Russian families are finding ways to learn the whereabouts of their loved ones at the front. In some cases, soldiers' coordinates are tracked via apps downloaded to their cell phones or SIM cards that are sold. But the authorities' efforts to conceal the losses have the opposite effect on families. As trust in the Kremlin rapidly erodes, pressure on soldiers at the front to come back or at least tell the truth is growing. Putin is facing a terrifying reality. Russia has run up a budget deficit of $61 billion in just 7 months. Costs are rising in line with the pace of the war, and the budget cannot keep up. In this equation, the army is competing with the rest of the state for money. In other words, the Russian army is naked. Putin is in bankruptcy. This is not a metaphor. The Russian economy cannot keep up with the army, and the numbers are slamming this harsh reality in Putin's face. On the one side, Ukraine is constantly targeting the Russian economy's arteries, and on the other, sanctions from the West are like a long-term paralysis. As a result, the Russian army is being sent to the front, naked and without ammunition, to die.
Не могу понять, какого хуя нас отправляют на убой.
The soldiers know this. Their options are desertion, switching sides, or waiting for death. But they don't fight for Putin or Russia because they are starving and naked. While Putin is dragging the country into bankruptcy, he doesn't care about the cries of soldiers' families, economic hardship, or lives. And the Russian economy has a budget deficit of $435 billion. This deficit is now hitting the Russian army the hardest. Putin is now desperately trying to close this deficit.
Priorities are being rewritten in Russia, and civilian spending is being pushed to the back burner.
And this is the kind of alignment you would least want to see in a country. Let's put a quick snapshot on the table. In the first 7 months of the year, the federal budget deficit rose to 4.9 trillion rubles. That's approximately $61 billion. The annual target has already been missed by months. This is not just a number, it's the direction of the trend. Government spending has increased by 1/5 compared to the same period last year. Revenue, on the other hand, has remained stagnant. As this asymmetry persists, deficits will continue to grow. And as deficits grow, financing costs will rise. Kiev, meanwhile, is determined to turn these voluntary reports from the front lines into a systematic process, rather than random gestures. To this end, the Ukrainian government has established a three-pronged and highly sophisticated intelligence-gathering mechanism. The first prong of the system consists of digital communication channels that are accessible 24/7. Special bots developed on Telegram are designed so that any Russian soldier can easily make contact. For those who want a higher level of security, an anonymous application called Surrender Chat, operating on the Tor network, is available. This system offers an accessible and untraceable way out, especially for soldiers who fear being monitored. The second step involves reintegration centers in Ukraine, where Russian soldiers who surrender or provide intelligence are received. This center, established in Poltava, is structured to operate not only in a military, but also in a humanitarian framework. Soldiers who surrender here are thoroughly interrogated under the supervision of United Nations officials. Those who pass the information verification process are issued an official humanitarian status document. This document protects those who surrender from allegations of war crimes and ensures they are treated in accordance with international law. The third pillar of the system is an openly attractive incentive program. Kiev offers personnel who provide critical information not only temporary protection, but also a long-term life plan. For these individuals, post-war status guarantees, permanent residency in Ukraine, or transfer to European countries are among the options being considered. For young, educated, and technically skilled personnel, this offer represents not only a means of escape, but also an opportunity for a new life. As a result, the system both enhances intelligence flows and deepens the disintegration within the Russian military. The Kremlin has taken panic measures to stop this erosion of loyalty on the front lines. The first of these was the deployment of strict control units called discipline trenches. The task of these units was to confiscate soldiers' personal devices before they could commit treason and cut off suspicious communications at the source. But in theory, discipline turned into oppression in practice. A catch and judge mentality began to prevail on the front lines. Soldiers found with unauthorized cell phones in the field are sent directly to martial law courts. So far, 491 cases have been sent to military judges in the war zone. This judicial crackdown is further undermining morale at the front by targeting not only those who leak information, but all soldiers who have confidence issues. The second measure is technological. The Kremlin has distributed a new generation of RF jamming modules, codenamed Resin Signal, to the front lines. In theory, this system is designed to disrupt encrypted data transfers, but the reality on the ground is quite different. Resin Signal only affects messaging apps that operate on certain wavelengths. This means that a photo of a paper map sent from a cell phone or a classic MMS message can reach the other side without being affected by this system. In other words, intelligence can be transported not only with high technology, but sometimes with old-fashioned methods as well. Contrary to expectations, all this repressive environment and technological measures are also having the opposite effect. Some soldiers on the front lines, believing they will face trial anyway, are beginning to see surrender or leaking information as a form of salvation, thinking, since punishment is inevitable, at least I can find a way out. These developments are shaking the image of charismatic commander-in-chief and disciplined army that Vladimir Putin has meticulously crafted over the years. In Kremlin propaganda, the Russian armed forces were presented as a war machine managed from a single center with a fully functioning chain of command. But the betrayals on the front lines and intelligence leaks from within are eroding this image on two fronts. In the outside world, especially in Western media, every new leak is reported with headlines like, "Putin doesn't control the army doesn't control Putin." This creates the impression that strategic decisions are not made from above, but are shaped by morale on the ground and the instinct for personal survival. The Kremlin's message that Putin is pulling all the strings in this war, which it has been repeating for years, is becoming increasingly less credible. The picture is even more complex within the country. The families of soldiers serving on the front lines are losing trust in the Kremlin's control of information as they see their sons' locations and even their dates of death being exposed on social media platforms. The question, if their locations can be revealed so easily, why are they still there, has become a daily query. Putin's powerful image as a leader on television is now giving way to skepticism in the silence of kitchens and living rooms. If these intelligence leaks continue at the same pace, the dynamics of the war could shift dramatically on three key fronts. First, artillery superiority could completely shift hands. Ukraine no longer fires blindly. It strikes Russian battery positions with centimeter precision, using coordinates obtained directly from inside the country. This forces Russian artillery units to constantly change positions and distribute their ammunition hastily and irregularly. Firepower decreases, accuracy drops, and panic grows. The second shift occurs in the supply chain. Fuel depots, bridges, or train lines that were previously targeted using reconnaissance satellites or reconnaissance flights are now directly targeted using information obtained from inside the country. As a result, logistical costs skyrocket. The number of soldiers and vehicles required to ensure the safe transport of an ammunition convoy doubles. Time is prolonged, risk increases, and the pulse of the front line slows. The third and perhaps most dangerous shift, a breakdown in morale. If the number of soldiers providing information from within or surrendering exceeds 5% of the total personnel, a psychological threshold is crossed. Questions such as, how many others are talking, and who leaked information in the neighboring battalion, spread among the soldiers. This kind of environment of distrust triggers herd mentality. Individual desertions turn into mass defections. The war begins to be lost not only on the battlefield, but also in the minds of the soldiers. Putin will probably resort to economic morphine in the short term to stop this trend. Pay raises for those serving on the front lines, extra compensation for their families, propaganda films with themes of execution for traitors. But all these steps have a common limitation: money. The ruble is now melting as fast as it is on the battlefield. Refineries ablaze from drone attacks, sabotaged railway lines, and now a wave of betrayal rising from within the front lines. Even the Kremlin's last reserves may not be enough to finance this new phase of the war, which is exploding from within. As a result, Moscow's narrative of a strong army and unwavering loyalty is now nothing more than window dressing. On the real front lines, it is not loyalty, but questioning that prevails. A soldier's armor can be repaired if it is pierced, but once doubt enters his mind, no amount of resources can fill that crack. Once trust is lost, it cannot be regained through propaganda, but only through a genuine sense of justice and meaning. If Russian tanks are being hit today not by enemy artillery but by coordinates coming from within, this is no longer an exception but the result of systemic decay. If the Kremlin cannot provide a satisfactory answer to the question echoing in the soldiers' minds, why am I fighting here? Then the direction of the war will no longer be determined by rockets, but by consciences. And those consciences are working in favor of Kiev, not the Kremlin. Thank you for watching. As the closure accelerated, the Russian army's large offensive lost ground. Regardless of political rhetoric about the collapse of the Russian plan, this is a tactical, operational reality. Ukrainian forces used counterfire and unmanned systems together to maintain uninterrupted pressure on mobile targets in this section. Counter-battery fire limited the movement of artillery units and put the protected supply lines of armored units at risk. the containment of infantry assault groups in forest strips was made possible by the cooperation of close air reconnaissance and ground surveillance units. This cooperation shifted the battlefield equation against the attacking forces and resulted in additional losses during the withdrawal and disintegration phase. The final picture along the Dobra-Pilia-Pokrovsk line demonstrates the effectiveness of Ukraine's flexible, repetitive, and reconnaissance-supported defense structure. This picture also reveals the weakness of Russian planning, namely the difficulty of synchronizing different units in the same salient in a short period of time. From Ukraine's perspective, this outcome has had an effect as significant as direct territorial gains, undermining the narrative prepared by the adversary. The mention of formations, such as Azov, the 7th Corps, the 38th Marine Brigade, and the 93rd Holodny Yar, underscores the collective nature of this effect. Given the rates reported by Russian prisoners, personnel losses are expected to have a shock effect at the local command level, leading to a slowdown in the pace of the offensive in the coming days. This slowdown will allow the defense to comfortably implement the clean-up fortification surveillance triad and create a new window for a counter-offensive. The factor that makes it difficult for elements withdrawn from the defense lines around Pokrovsk to return to the same lines is continuous harassment and fire pressure. This pressure targets logistical nodes and advance corridors simultaneously, delaying the re-establishment of plans. When combined, the data on the ground indicates that Russia's rhetoric of a major offensive has failed to produce results at the local level and has turned into a retreat on the Pokrovsk line. This transformation is important from an operational narrative perspective because successful defense in difficult areas increases the cost of subsequent offensives and increases the deterrence factor. The Ukrainian side has disrupted the enemy's force concentration plans by spreading its destructive power across a wide front rather than concentrating it in a single point in order to increase this deterrence factor. This approach is based on a reconnaissance strike cycle, multi-layered defense, and rapid resupply equation. Zelensky's public message of gratitude confirmed that this equation is working on the ground and highlighted the critical role played by certain units. Indicators to watch in the coming days around Pokrovsk and Dobra-Pilia include the speed of Russian troop rotations and whether there is a permanent narrowing of the salient. In addition, the upward trend in the number of prisoners and the continuation of permanent clearance in residential areas provide clues about the sustainability of the defense. The figures provided by the Ukrainian side are open to independent verification, but the fact that different sources point to the same picture is sufficient to indicate the direction of the trend. The geopolitical significance of the Dobra-Pilia-Pokrovsk axis is that it determines the credibility of the reality on the ground at the negotiating table. As long as this credibility is maintained, rhetoric about a major offensive will not automatically translate into an advantage at the negotiating table. Ukrainian forces have not only held the line during this process, but also narrowed risky protrusions and pushed Russian elements out of their defensive positions. These developments provide concrete data for the debate in European and transatlantic capitals over whether the reality on the ground or negotiations will be decisive. The direction of the dataset is clear and indicates that as of today, the upper hand has shifted in favor of the defense in the Pokrovsk-Dobra-Pilia sector. The failure of the more than 110,000 Russian personnel deployed to the region to achieve results at the planned pace has given the opposing side time and maneuvering space. This situation also confronts the Russian side with the costs of new reinforcements and reorganization. From Ukraine's perspective, the most critical risk is maintaining positions and ensuring that supply chains remain uninterrupted following these successes. If this risk is managed, it appears possible that gains along the Pokrovsk axis could become permanent and that protrusions could be normalized. Zelensky's direct acknowledgement of specific units was chosen to communicate this goal of permanence to both the military and the public. Current data from the field shows that the Russian large-scale offensive has failed to produce the desired effect in this phase and has turned into a tactical failure. Ukraine's defense counterattack mix has made it possible for plans to collapse in Pokrovsk and for the attacking forces to be pushed back. The sustainability of this equation depends on keeping the reconnaissance strike cycle open and preventing flanking movements. As of today, the available evidence and official statements indicate progress in these two areas. The most active combat zone in the Pokrovsk sector has the potential to gradually give way to stabilization and mop-up operations. Does all this mean the end for the Russian army? The most likely option for Moscow is to continue gradual grinding attacks along the Donetsk line, while conducting limited incursions in the north around Kharkiv and Sumy to exert pressure and launching intensive air missile drone campaigns against energy infrastructure during the winter. A broader maneuver operation beyond this would be very risky due to current casualty rates, the quality of training and equipment, and the external dependencies of the supply chain. The most significant factor shaping the situation on the ground is the personnel and material losses accumulated during more than 2 years of attrition warfare. According to open-source consolidations and Western intelligence summaries, Russian total casualties as of mid-2025 point to a pool of dead and wounded exceeding millions. Current compilations by the UK Ministry of Defence and think tanks provide a common range, with approximately 250,000 of these being completely eliminated and the remainder wounded. This directly affects the cost of continuing the war and the quality of the trained reserve pool needed for a new offensive. To balance the loss pressure, Moscow is using 2 levers. The first is the readjustment of domestic industry. Artillery ammunition production in Russia is on the rise compared to 2024, with several million 122/152mm shells now possible to produce annually, and a monthly target of 200,000 to 250,000 reported widely. The second is external procurement. It has been confirmed that shipments equivalent to tens of millions of rounds from North Korea have accelerated since the end of 2024, sustaining Russia's artillery firepower. This external supply is not limited to artillery ammunition. Transfers of multiple rocket launchers and short-range ballistic missiles have also been documented. While this picture fuels the powder keg of a large-scale ground offensive, the quality of modern armored platforms and shortages of trained personnel remain separate bottlenecks. The impact of UMPK-guided glide bombs, which have created a decisive difference in air-to-ground firepower, became dominant in 2024 to 2025. RUSI's tactical development analyses reveal that this munition has assumed a role in suppressing positions and consuming lines with high efficiency. On the other hand, it has been reported that Ukraine has begun to partially suppress the ability of this threat to shape the rear lines through countermeasures and deployment changes. Thus, Russian air long-range firepower remains a lever for a new offensive, but is not a guarantee of automatic breakthrough. In the long-range strike domain, 2 opposing trends are at play simultaneously. On the one hand, US defense intelligence findings indicate that Russia has improved the maneuverability and terminal performance of ballistic systems such as the Iskander class. This creates moments when Patriot-based air defense is challenged. On the other hand, Ukraine is trying to make hit-and-run air operations more costly with the gradual arrival of F-16s and the expansion of its air defense layer. A new Russian offensive could take shape amid this two-pronged dynamic. In addition, the dynamics of a new Russian offensive within the front are slowly becoming clearer. The first possibility is renewed pressure on the Donetsk fortified belt and the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk line. The intersection of Russia's operational and political objectives is the capture of the entire Donetsk Oblast. ISW's latest assessments emphasize that the fortified ring of cities, which has been reinforced layer by layer since 2014, has not been breached since 2022 and continues to determine the design of the front line. Therefore, a possible renewed push in the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya direction would provide the shortest political route to ultimately approach Kramatorsk-Sloviansk. However, there are dense trench minefields and deep defense lines around populated areas along this axis. The pace of Russian advances remains dependent on a meter-by-meter gain strategy, at the cost of heavy losses. A new attempt is likely to involve multi-axis pressure north and east of Pokrovsk, suppressive fire around Chasiv Yar, and a pincer movement south of Lyman. Kramatorsk/Sloviansk is expected to be targeted through prolonged attrition rather than direct assault. Therefore, gradual grinding rather than a swift breakout is the most likely scenario. Another possibility is that Russian forces may create pressure threats in the direction of Kharkiv. The Vovchansk-Liptse line, which originated in Belgorod, had come back into focus with the opening of the Northern Front in 2024. Media sources reported that armored infiltration pressure along this line had resulted in territorial gains in border villages, but that the concentration of forces and logistical preparations for a major urban offensive were insufficient. There are no signs of preparations for a full-scale encirclement of Kharkiv in the summer of 2025. However, pressure aimed at making the city uninhabitable and forcing Ukraine to shift forces could be a natural component of new offensive plans. Possible targets in this context include transportation hubs immediately south of the border, Kharkiv's eastern and northeastern suburbs, and air and missile pressure aimed at closing authorized counterattack/SID windows against targets inside Ukraine's Belgorod region. Another possible Russian objective is to continue efforts to establish a buffer zone in Sumy. In early 2025, limited infiltration occupation attempts were observed in the Sumy Oblast, accompanied by Russian rhetoric about a buffer zone. Regional authorities reported that the advances have not yet turned into a large-scale encirclement or a thrust toward major cities. However, persistent pressure on Sumy, along with Kharkiv, forces Ukraine to spread its forces across the entire north and delays the preparation of reserves for the main front in Donetsk. The new offensive model could use this secondary axis as a stabilizing and distracting factor. A large-scale urban battle for the city center of Sumy ranks low in the priority list in terms of logistical and political gains versus costs. However, railway, road junctions and energy substations along the border remain on the regular target list. The possibility of an advance along the Orikhiv-Robotyne-Tokmak axis in the Zaporizhzhia sector should also not be overlooked. This axis, which served as Ukraine's southern counteroffensive theater in 2023, functions for the Russian side to reinforce the Crimean land corridor and expand the defensive belt east of the Dnipro. The advantage for a new Russian offensive is that existing deep fortifications and minefields can limit Ukrainian maneuverability. The disadvantage is that the heavily populated areas and deep defenses along the Tokmak-Melitopol axis make progress costly for both sides. The approach of narrowing positions and keeping Ukraine's supply routes within artillery range, using a stepping stone logic, may continue along this line. Larger targets further inland, such as the city of Dnipro, are not realistic for ground forces in the near term but will be continuously pressured by missile drone attacks. On the final axis, there are bridgeheads on the opposite bank of the Kherson Dnieper. A large-scale crossing operation on the left riverbank section of the Dnipro would require significant floating bridge capacity, simultaneous CAD-CAD, and high-tempo close-air UAV cover. Given Ukraine's sensor fire depth along the river, the Russian side would need to manage such a large-scale crossing operation with surprise and accept losses. Therefore, the Kherson axis remains secondary and opportunistic for a new offensive, with low likelihood of expansion beyond local bridgeheads and island coastal raids. We see all these possibilities. Ukraine is also likely aware of new Russian threats. However, if Kiev manages to maintain the advantage it has gained in Donetsk, particularly along the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya line, this will have a positive impact across all fronts. This is because the Russians will face shortages across all fronts, from Kharkiv and Zaporizhzhia to Kherson, in their efforts to reverse the deteriorating situation in Donetsk. Thank you for watching. It is clear that this pace cannot be maintained for much longer, because another indicator is flashing red at the same time. Oil and gas revenues are sounding the alarm. In June and July, there were declines of up to 1/3 year-on-year. In July, oil and gas revenues fell by approximately 27% compared to the previous year. The cumulative decline for the first 7 months is around 19%. These revenues remain the most critical cash item in the budget. The decline is directly constricting the financial lifeline. The price side is also unfriendly. Brent eased to the $66 per barrel range at the beginning of August. As prices fall, Russia's tax and customs revenues are also shrinking. Due to the strong ruble, the average ruble-denominated barrel price remains below the budget target. This is also dragging down collections. Now let's zoom out. The share of defense spending has reached one of the highest levels in history. In the 2025 budget, national defense accounts for 1/3 of the total. The ratio to GDP is approximately 6.3%. The highest since the end of the Cold War. As the war drags on, this ratio is squeezing civilian spending further. Does such a heavy burden mean that the military will find more resources despite everything? The answer is short. No, because the growth rate of the pie has slowed, the revenue side is under pressure, and financing options are narrowing. These are three interlocking gears. The key issue is frozen assets. The European Union and G7 have immobilized approximately 260 billion euros of Russian central bank reserves. The total global figure is estimated at around $300 billion. The lion's share is held by European custodial institutions. Access to this money is blocked, and its returns are increasingly being redirected in favor of Ukraine. As for private assets, a range of $50 to $60 billion can be used as a baseline for frozen private wealth across the coalition. The European Union alone has stated that it has frozen over 28 billion euros in private assets. Switzerland's data also completes this picture. These figures further increase the total frozen amount. Let us draw a critical line here. The frozen reserves could be released one day. However, this depends on an uncertain timeline and heavy political conditions. Therefore, from Russia's perspective, the reality today is that these funds cannot be used. Their contribution to short-term cash flow is zero. The European Union is directly transferring the additional revenues generated by these immobilized assets to Ukraine. The latest tranche amounted to 1.6 billion euros. This regular flow also impacts the war's financing equation. From the Kremlin's perspective, this represents a loss of opportunity in foreign currency. Can we consolidate all these headings into a single cost table? A cautious lower bound estimate can be made. Let's take the frozen central bank reserves at the coalition level at around $300 billion. Add the total of over $58 billion identified for frozen private assets. The sum of these two amounts to at least $358 billion. When the $61 billion deficit from the first 7 months of the year is added, the total reaches $419 billion. Note that the annual decline in oil and gas revenues in the first 7 months of 2025 has created a cash deficit of roughly $15 to $16 billion. The lower bound total comes to around $435 billion. We have avoided double counting in this accounting. Frozen reserves and private assets are stock. The deficit and revenue decline are flows. The total based on these items in separate categories provides a snapshot of today. Tomorrow's risks could enlarge the picture. Let us open a parenthesis here. This lower limit does not include indirect items such as production losses, long-term growth damage, and financing costs. Additionally, the erosion of the liquid portion of reserves and the interest burden from domestic borrowing are separate issues. When all these are added, the real economic cost rises further. Let's look at the reserve front. The liquid portion of the National Wealth Fund had dropped from $112.7 billion before the war to around $40 billion this spring. Temporary increases were observed in some months due to budget transfers. However, the downward trend persisted. This indicates that the flexibility of the fund, which serves as a cushion, has decreased. How long can the liquid portion of the fund withstand this pace? The Ministry of Finance is using foreign exchange sales from this fund to cushion the deficit within the framework of the budget rule. As energy revenues fall below target, sales will have to increase. This weakens the fund's ability to rebuild. The labor market is also sounding the alarm. Official unemployment is at a historic low, but hidden unemployment and idle capacity are rising. Migrants are filling the gap, especially in the construction, logistics, and agriculture sectors. This is causing tension. While civil authorities welcome them, security forces are taking harsh measures, accusing them of everything from terrorism to economic sabotage. Raids and deportations have become routine in some cities. As wages rise rapidly due to the war, the civilian sector is losing its skilled workforce. This is exacerbating inflation and productivity issues. According to official figures, inflation is hovering around 9%. However, it is felt much more acutely in key sectors such as food, auto parts, and construction materials. The central bank is trying to curb inflation with high interest rates ranging from 18% to 30% for borrowers in 2025. However, no legitimate business can survive under these conditions. Repaying a loan at these rates is nearly impossible. As a result, investments are collapsing. Purchases of expensive machinery, fertilizers, vehicles, and other essential goods have nearly ground to a halt. Slowdown in the private sector is evident everywhere. Small businesses are closing down in large numbers. New private projects are stalling due to insufficient financing. If the war economy continues at this pace, which areas will be cut? Social spending, investments, or an inflation cycle suppressed by monetary policy?
Every option comes at a cost, and every cost returns as a political price.
Another practical channel straining the revenue side is the shadow fleet.
The growth of the network of old tankers used to circumvent embargoes and price caps has slowed.
The US, the UK, and the EU have increased pressure by imposing sanctions on hundreds of ships and intermediaries. As this circle tightens, the netback of Russian crude oil is falling further.
The EU is tightening measures such as price caps and refinery bans.
Efforts to prevent products made from Russian crude oil from returning through the back door are gaining traction.
This aims to preserve the discount mechanism and limit revenues.
The impact is heavy but cumulative, and it is being felt on the budget side.
If oil remains stuck in the $60 to $70 range, how long can the budget hold out? The downward revision of the energy revenue target already reflects this. An increase in the deficit share of GDP is inevitable. If the cycle tightens, domestic borrowing costs will act as a second brake. Messages from the US side are also increasing pressure. The statement that the Russian economy is in bad shape reflects an expectation, even if it is politically motivated. The expectation is that pressure will continue through the price channel, and that returns from frozen assets will keep flowing to Ukraine. These two channels are squeezing the budget simultaneously. Now let's look at it from the military perspective. Defense spending is at record levels. Personnel incentives, bonuses, and compensation are straining the budget. Wages in the military industry have sharply increased, generally being 2 to 3 times higher than equivalent civilian jobs. Many blue-collar specialists, particularly mechanics, drivers, welders, and machine operators, are now either working for military contractors or serving in occupied territories. Agriculture and heavy industry are suffering from a loss of skilled labor. A tractor mechanic in the Bryansk region can earn 45,000 rubles per month. The same person could earn 150,000 rubles by joining a military support unit in Donetsk. The high wages offered to meet the demand for labor are fueling wage inflation in the civilian sector. This labor distortion is also affecting sectors. As truck drivers disappear, logistics networks are weakening. Some regional hospitals are reporting longer delays in ambulance responses. The reason is not a lack of vehicles, but a lack of drivers. A sustainable balance is in question. Field realities impact the revenue side. As losses increase, personnel costs rise. As equipment consumption accelerates, replenishment costs increase. As production capacity is diverted from the civilian sector, productivity losses become permanent. The sum of these factors masks GDP growth, but pulls down prosperity. Where will the prolongation of the war lead the balance between domestic demand and investment? How can growth inflated by military production be transitioned to a peace economy? How can capacity, demand, and price dynamics be normalized? Does the political calendar allow for this? The external trade channel has also been hit hard. Gas flows through the pipeline to the EU are weak compared to pre-war levels. The northern gas pipelines are effectively out of service. Crude oil has shifted from Europe to Asia, but the discount is permanent. Every discount is a line item missing from the budget. Let us return to the discussion of the total cost. We provided a conservative range and estimated a lower limit of around $435 billion. This is the rough total of the deficit and the revenue decline by 2025. In addition to frozen public and private assets, this total could grow as risk channels activate. For example, if price caps are tightened, sanctions on the shadow fleet are deepened, or interest rates remain high for longer. The legal front is also important. European institutions are seeking more efficient ways to manage the interest income from immobilized reserves. The idea of shifting toward riskier instruments is on the table. This could increase returns but also amplify legal and systemic risks. The debate encompasses both political will and financial stability. The message within this equation is clear. Record defense spending, weak revenues, pressured reserves, and frozen foreign assets. The cost of the war is growing steadily without causing panic. This resembles the classic sugar rush, strain grind sequence. In the sugar rush at the start of the war, unused resources were diverted to production. GDP growth appeared deceptively strong, masking deeper vulnerabilities. In the strain phase, sanctions and trade disruptions hit hard. However, fiscal stimulus kept the machine running. Corruption increased as companies diverted internal resources to contract. Social spending was cut to support the military budget. The third phase is slow grinding. Core income sources, oil, gas, foreign investment, are shrinking. Deficits are growing, labor shortages are intensifying. The state is beginning to consume its own reserves and institutions to finance the war. The Russian economy has entered the third phase. In other words, the state is consuming its own institutions to finance the war. At the same time, it is relying on banks, state-owned companies, and domestic borrowing. Every step is buying time for the next crisis, but the price is being paid in interest, inflation, and the quality of growth. Now let's return to the results on the ground. As money tightens, the army cuts back on its second and third priorities. The pace of modernization slows down. Pressure increases on maintenance, repairs, and training. A long war cannot be managed with a short budget. What will the Kremlin choose in this scenario? Will it cut social spending, Or will it try to print money and accept inflation? Both paths have political costs. The choice between the two will determine the rhythm of the war. In terms of external options, the solutions are limited. The China and India route does not work without discounts. The threat of secondary sanctions could make this route even riskier. The financing route is expensive, with Western markets closed. The remaining space is narrow. Let's step back and summarize briefly. The deficit is growing. Revenue is falling. The defense share is at a historic high. Access to frozen assets is being cut off. And the reserve cushion is shrinking. The name of this picture is simple. The free fall of the war economy. It is still manageable today. But every month, the room for maneuver shrinks. Tolerance for mistakes shrinks. And resilience to shocks shrinks. What if oil takes another hit? What if the price cap tightens further? What if there are new arrests in the shadow fleet network? Each of these three scenarios would open a new hole in the budget. If all three occur simultaneously, the resilience threshold would be reached rapidly. While the EU is accelerating returns from immobilized assets, it also intends to increase the pace of this flow. This means the opportunity cost for Russia is becoming permanent. Time is working against Russia, because every month that passes increases the cash deficit. Today's question is this: will this equation push the Kremlin to the negotiating table? The answer lies in the pace of the fiscal calendar. If deficits accelerate, reserves deplete, and borrowing costs rise, the answer could be yes. Everyone seeking to reduce risk must manage the price and sanctions channels more rigorously. In summary, Ukraine is holding its ground on the battlefield in some form. The Allied system is maintaining pressure through financial channels. Russia's economy, however, is under strain in three key areas. Cash flow is tightening, foreign reserves are locked up, the internal buffer is thinning, and defense spending is squeezing the civilian economy. Therefore, we must describe the situation without exaggeration but without hiding the facts. Based on today's data, the Russian war economy has entered a controlled freefall. Where deficits are combined with a 20% increase in spending, there can be no miracle. The solution lies either in reducing the cost of the war or reinventing financing. The latter is difficult, the former is painful but realistic. And with each passing month, the window of opportunity narrows. How much longer do you think this equation can hold? We look forward to your comments. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching. The Russian elite is preparing for a post-Putin Kremlin, while also looking for ways to escape from Russia during the current war.
We must tackle the oligarchs here and go after their money.
There are silent protests in the streets because open action is too risky. Inflation is ticking away in homes, and grocery bills are getting a little higher every week. Among the elite, escape plans and post-Putin work desks are multiplying, and closed meetings are getting longer and longer. Now, private jets are no longer flying from Moscow to the west, but more frequently to safe havens outside the west. There are fluctuations in the value of summer homes outside the city, as some are converting to cash and others are fortifying their shelters. A new clinic in the Alps, a quiet facility on the Black Sea dubbed a guest house, a service office in Dubai. Let's not romanticize any of this. These are just signs, reflexes, preparations, but they all converge in a single sentence. The system has not taken the possibility of an after off the table. And as that possibility grows, things that were once whispered are now spoken aloud in broad daylight. There are now two plans under the same roof. How do I survive today? And how do I stay afloat tomorrow? Some oligarchs are keeping their faces hidden, while others are looking too closely at the camera. Both are saying the same thing: uncertainty is growing. In the corridors of the Kremlin, there is another kind of panic. The chain of command is shouting louder, notes are being written more concisely, and fewer hands are willing to take risks. When the weary news from the front lines meets the cold numbers from the market at the same table, everyone quietly murmurs the same question: what will happen next? Some brush it off with, "We'll get through the day." Others brace themselves with, "one day." Now, Putin is in panic mode. Because the preview of the Soviet collapse is unfolding. From the outside, the walls appear solid, but inside, small thresholds are piling up behind the doors. This is not a storm that will erupt overnight, but a long-term shift in the weather. Some are looking for an umbrella, some are building a roof, and others are drawing new escape routes on the map. So what will this wave of whispers turn into? An escape, a rehearsal, or a strange mixture of both? The language of power has become sharper, shorter, and more directive in the last 2 years. The war economy, the security reflex, and the feeling of, if not now, then when, have made the state more vertical. Verticalization brings speed, but if it persists, it erodes horizontal trust. Institutions hide bad news as much as good news, and files pile up in wait-and-see folders. Those who write orders shout louder, those who read them take fewer risks, and in the middle ranks, the art of not making mistakes becomes the new name for career advancement. And when everyone shifts into this mode at the same time, the small minority at the top grows heavier, while the majority below slows down. In such times, even if the chairs remain in place, the way people sit changes. Some lean their elbows on the armrests, others plant their feet firmly on the ground. Some keep one eye on the door and the other on their phone. These are the days when whoever calls, goes. The capital is where power is seen. The real story begins where power is shared. The Siloviki, or security corps, want more control, clearer rules, stricter boundaries, and faster compliance. Technocrats, on the other hand, are tasked with keeping the system running. Budget, money, imports, production, labor. When the two meet at the table, the file can flow smoothly or become as solid as a mountain. The state-linked business world is the third leg of this table. Tenders, mines, energy, railways, defense, and telecommunications are the veins that feed it. In this layer, courage and caution coexist. While smiling for the camera, a new contract draft is being written with the legal advisor. Families listen more closely to other languages. Children's school plans are redrawn, and option passports are taken off the shelf. No one says it will end tomorrow, but no one says it will last forever. This is the name of the grey area. If the phone rings in the middle of the night, who goes to whom? The answer to this question is whispered in every room these days. The cost of war is heavy not only on the battlefield, but also in the accounting books. Import substitution lines have been opened, but quality is fluctuating, and costs are up and down. Financing has been shifted to the state, banks have swollen with public debt, and private credit has become more selective. Now, elite behavior and budget lines meet on the same graph, because money flows where power flows. In the 2025 budget, the defense budget's share of GDP has reached the highest level since the post-Soviet era. The share of defense and security in total spending has become more pronounced. The state's coffers are weighed down by the dark gravity of war. More weapons, more ammunition, more contracts. This is not a matter of increasing the numbers or filling in the gaps. This is about which class and which circle will remain in the decision-making room tomorrow. A war economy first changes factories, then languages. 2 more shifts in a month, 2 more suppliers in a year, 2 more zeros after a period. However, as this multiplier grows, the resource pool does not expand. Energy revenues are volatile due to high discounts and freight insurance costs. Margin pressure is putting strain on the budget. A window to Asia has opened, but discounts have grown, and logistics costs have eaten into profits. Access to technology now flows through capillaries. Every new device is a test, every software update an adventure. Growth potential has been constrained, productivity momentum has slowed, and the defense-first budget stance has deepened. Social spending has also increased. It is not a choice but a necessity. Investments in infrastructure and human capital are being spread out over time and written off as, "We'll look into it later." In the short term, the wheels are turning, but in the medium term, the chrome is peeling off. It can be polished, but finding new parts is difficult. Many ask where the break will come from. Sometimes the break doesn't come, but flexibility does. And when flexibility lasts too long, the system wears out prematurely. Regions in this story are not just maps, but budgets. The North Caucasus is young and dynamic. The line between security and local politics is thin. In the Volga-Ural region, identity and economy go hand in hand. A bigger share is not just a slogan, but real money going into the coffers. The Far East and Siberia are vast, remote, and resource-rich. Proximity to China creates economic pull. Kaliningrad, meanwhile, is geography's joke. NATO pressure and logistics keep it breathing through a thin vein. Metropolises are distinct. Culture, technology, an educated middle class, A service economy, migration, and the dream of migration coexist under the same roof. These cities are strong in their ability to adapt, cautious in their forms of dissent. They invest in assets, jobs, visas, and passports, not in the streets. When the rhythm difference between the center and the periphery grows, it's not a rupture but a loss of coordination. The same music plays, but everyone walks at a different tempo. When coordination is lost, who will say, "Stop"? That's the real knot. The security apparatus's network within the city is now more visible. Rosgvardia has positioned itself as the insurance of mass order. Its presence has become part of everyday life. The FSB sets the rhythm beyond control. The pulse of information flow beats there. As grey areas grow in the fields of mobilization and counter-mobilization, the language of command and control simplifies, but it wears people down. What is wearing out is not just the shine of the paint on the helmets. It is the internal communication of institutions, the trust between the field and the desk, and the energy of the middle management who say, "I'll take care of it." General changes, promotions, and dismissals make the news. What matters is not the news itself, but its frequency. As frequency increases, the sense of stability diminishes. Files seem to be person-centered rather than system-centered. Whoever speaks in the command room determines which doors open below. If the answer is unclear, everyone slows down. Whose orders are followed? If this question can be answered on a routine day, not just in a crisis, the system can breathe. In times when the economy and security are so intertwined, money speaks more honestly. Capital does not read political texts. It looks at risk premiums and legal certainty. Some assets are moved to friendly jurisdictions, some are divided into trusts, and some partnership shares are transferred to invisible partners. Family files swell, new country options for children, new job plans for spouses, and health records for parents are compiled. The language of business people changes. Where they once spoke of investment, now they speak of flexibility. Where they once spoke of growth, now they speak of resilience. The central bank and the treasury seek to reverse this behavior by providing liquidity, rules, and incentives. These measures work to some extent, buying time. However, investor psychology listens more to rhythm than numbers. If the rhythm is not steady, money stays as a guest. One night, it seems like nothing has happened, but when you wake up in the morning, there is a new cashier at your neighbor's shop. This is the silent statement of capital. All of this picture is incomplete without the external environment. The European and Atlantic axis has locked onto the Ukraine issue, codifying the energy-finance-technology divide. It hasn't completely closed the door on a return, but it has subjected it to harsh conditions. Verification, timelines, monitoring, and penalties for violations. The Asian axis has become the anchor. China has written the rules of the game with its large market, credit, standards, and technology. India, Turkey, and the Gulf are both markets and transit points. However, every opportunity is also a bargaining chip. Africa and the Middle East are opening new paths, but logistics are long and the risk premium is high. This asymmetric network limits Moscow's bargaining power. Sales exist, but there is no margin. Access exists, but standards are outside. Partnership exists, but who holds the pen remains a never-ending debate. A channel that worked last night may close this morning. Therefore, planning requires patience and execution requires reflexes. Where is bargaining power eroding? Whoever sets the standards holds the reins. Let's address the dangerous question on everyone's mind. Will there be a second Soviet collapse? Major collapses are rarely as loud as they are in legends. In reality, systems break down while still functioning. A sharp decline requires 5 or 6 thresholds to be crossed simultaneously. Loss of control in leadership, paramilitarization in the regions, a break in the financial chain, a sudden cut in energy revenues, a ready and willing design in the outside world, and a weary acceptance of this within the country. This combination is rare. It is uncommon but not impossible. More likely is a prolonged stagnation. The power shell is rigid, growth is low, the budget is squeezed between military and social spending, brain drain and capital flight are silent but persistent, and the rule of law is on paper but not in practice. The system is not collapsing, but it cannot be renewed. This is precisely what is meant by weary stability. As for those who ask whether a pivot similar to the Yeltsin era will come, history does not repeat itself with the same actors on the same stage. The social memory of those days is costly and painful. Today, core conditions are needed for such a pivot: a sharper decline in economic indicators, a wave of war fatigue that crosses the threshold, the visible evasion of responsibility among the elite, the security apparatus becoming clear on non-intervention, and political consensus on a gradual conditional finance technology package in the outside world. Theoretically possible, practically unlikely. But unlikely does not mean impossible. It remains a thin branch on the tree of probability, which could thicken if the wind picks up. Which branch is thicker? Today's signals favor a hard shell, long stagnation. The situation within the army cannot be summed up in the cold sentences of political science. In a protracted war, loyalty and fatigue walk hand in hand. The burden is not equal between those who give and those who receive. Some units are heavily engaged, some are in reserve, and some are on special missions. Veteran networks can be more effective than municipalities and councils. This is not unknown, but it is ignored. When salaries and compensation are delayed, whispers grow louder. When logistics falter, complaints harden. Tactical criticisms turn into strategic debates. Can all this be easily suppressed? Yes, it can. But what is suppressed does not disappear. It accumulates, changes shape, and seeps out elsewhere. What the military wants most is clear objectives, reasonable timelines, and adequate resources. When all three are lacking, orders become shorter but harder to follow. The question of whose orders are followed resurfaces, and if the answer is unclear, even those willing to take risks hit the brakes. On the societal front, the mathematics of daily life is more persuasive than anything else. Wage increases lag behind prices in most sectors. Food and rent pressures strain household budgets. Second jobs, freelance work, and informal solutions are on the rise. City cards, discounts, promotions, and installments are part of everyday language. Healthcare and education are kept at a passable level. There are good examples, but the average is expensive. Digital surveillance is growing. Citizen compliance is increasing. Forms of dissent are shifting to the private sphere. Parents are more pragmatic. A good school for their children, a safe passport, a home with fast internet. Logistics are discussed more than politics. This middle class is the country's barometer. If their hope curve breaks, the economy will drop from manageable to insufficient. Where will society's patience crack? When small moments of justice inside and small windows of opportunity outside close at the same time. External actors are not emotional when looking at this picture. They are calculating. Europe's priorities are security and stability, the predictability of energy flows, the calm management of borders, and the reduction of migration and cyber risks. America's priority is not to disrupt the rhythm of NATO, to maintain the same tempo in both the Pacific and European arenas. China's priority is the market and corridors, to draft its own plans, to expand trade without loosening the reins on credit and technology conditions. Turkey, India, and Gulf players want to open up space, trade, logistics, energy, defense. None of them want a hard collapse, not just because of the nuclear file, but because of the waves in the market. That is why a controlled transition seems to be the only common interest, painful but manageable. What outcome does the world want? The clear answer is, not shock, but calibrated change. When you lay out the probability tree on the table and trace each branch, 4 main paths emerge. The first is a continuation of the status quo. A hard shell, low growth, prolonged stagnation, and controlled pressure. The second is a minor political adjustment. Technocrats gain more influence, rhetoric softens, and the economic agenda shifts back to a productivity and process vocabulary. The third is a shock. Internal governance cracks, an unexpected health security incident, or an economic downturn triggers a small change of hands, giving rise to a transition council. The fourth is a major rupture. Thresholds are crossed simultaneously, regional paramilitarization and financial chains break, with heavy packages abroad and heavy costs at home. The most likely of these 4 is a mix of the first two. The third path is low probability but high impact, lurking on the sidelines. The fourth is the one that keeps strategists awake at night, but it is the least desired outcome, and therefore the most sought after to prevent. This is why the question of who will answer the phone is so important. Will it be a technocrat, a pragmatist from the security establishment, or a collective council? If any of the answers inspire confidence, money will flow in, credit spreads will narrow, and morale in the city will recover quickly. Otherwise, everyone will go into "we'll decide today" mode. The nuclear command and control chain is at the top of the list in each of these scenarios. The professionalism of institutions is an undisputed priority here. International pressure is also the harshest in this area. Major powers do not want a hard collapse. Therefore, transition protection umbrella becomes the key phrase. Energy and pipelines, ports and maritime traffic, railways and customs are all part of the same equation. The risk of accidents cannot be eliminated, but it can be reduced. While all this is happening, the small scenes of daily life provide the real education. If a company's CFO is talking too technically during a balance sheet presentation, there is a political warning in the footnotes. If a municipality postpones a tender twice, it means the rhythm of the treasury is disrupted. If a regional leader is traveling more frequently to Ankara, Beijing, or Dubai compared to before, it is not just about tourism, it is about seeking new bridges. If a television debate suddenly shifts to discussing quality and process, it means the rhetoric is giving way to practice. If a social media account doesn't say "we'll return to normal," it first says "let's return to procedure." This is a statement of intent. Micro-signals are more reliable than big words. Big words shed light on performance, small signals on mindset. Now let's go back to the first scene. Private jets, moving safes, school lists, second passport files. It is possible to be angry at this picture, or to romanticize it. But what is important for the analyst is to understand. Each one is a small insurance policy, a small bridge, a small escape. Together, they form a big sentence. Horizontal trust within the country is declining. When horizontal trust declines, leadership wants more control, sometimes giving more, sometimes taking more. In this ebb and flow, the skill lies in increasing the margin of flexibility. Rigidity is not always strength. Sometimes strength is flexibility. Those who understand this remain at the table, those who don't become files on the table. What we call post-Russia is actually the way Russia is rewriting itself. Some see it as minor adjustments, others as major revisions, and still others as mere extensions. The truth is often a middle ground where these three intertwine. One day a decree is issued, the next day a promotion comes, the third day a tender is cancelled, the fourth day a letter leaks. Arn Rustran Satters, the sum of these points to a direction. To see where the sign is pointing, one must remain calm, filter out the daily noise, and collect the micro signs. So, will these developments bring disaster and a second Soviet collapse for Russia? 1. Budgetary drag becomes entrenched. The defense share sticks around 8%, and a recession, like cooling, extends into 2026. 2. The regional unequal prosperity boom begins to fade. Consumption islands dry up, unemployment returns. 3. The elites impose either a hard minimum or a soft transition. Internal bargaining comes to the fore. 4. The external wing deepens financial filtration. Shadow channels narrow. Cash becomes king in the new still life. 5. A discipline crisis, reflected in the public sphere, erupts within the military security bloc. It becomes difficult to contain. 6. Not a second Soviet collapse, but a long stagnation new poverty pendulum begins, which puts pressure on the political form. 7. The post-crisis guide could turn into a controlled Boris-style showcase. The showcase softens, but the core remains hard. If the defense-focused budget coma prolongs, the economic consent base of the founding coalition erodes. If elite-level horizontal distrust, region-center tensions, and institutional fatigue converge, transition could be triggered from within. Rather than a Soviet-style sudden collapse, a hybrid transition blending partial outward openness with a Yeltsin-style facade and core security rigidity could unfold over a timeline compressed from years to months. The Russian elite is well aware of this scenario. The public may not be fully conscious of it, but the elite sees it clearly. The only constant parameter in this scenario is the duration of the war. What happens if the duration is shortened? There will be a capacity shock, unemployment may spike, and consumption bubbles will burst. Do the elites know this? Yes, that is why they have two plans. To maintain today, they will use the defense budget, and to save tomorrow, they will use the exit ramp. Let's note this sentence. The war economy burns not only ammunition but also routine. Because as instant decisions accumulate, institutional rules erode. And one day everyone realizes, our constitution has turned into an emergency regulation. On that day, preparations for the aftermath will spread from a few desks to the entire room. Let us accept this text, not as a wish, but as a reading. We have followed the data, analyzed the trends, and discussed the possibilities. So, who is with whom? What is visible today may not be tomorrow, but not writing about tomorrow is the worst preparation. If the defense security share remains high, wage growth slows, and inflation stays stuck in the 6 to 8% range, if the regional central divide widens and cracks appear in the military security sector, if financial channels narrow further, it won't be the 1990s, but a long stagnation will be inevitable. This can be reduced to a one-sentence risk for Putin. As the defense-focused order prolongs, the consent base erodes, and if that base collapses, the aftermath will not be written in a single night, but in the shadows. Elite networks are doing the same. They write, they erase, they rewrite. No one speaks loudly in the dark corridors of the Kremlin, but everyone reads lips. While Russians rehearse for the after, they are also looking for a way out of today. And the leading role on stage is not looking at a single actor, but at a single number, the share of defense spending. As that share falls, there is room to breathe. As it rises, breathing becomes more difficult. So, who stays? Who goes? Who speeds up? Who slows down? It is essential to read the fragility alongside power, the possibility alongside fragility, and the risk alongside possibility. The sum total whispers to us, power and fragility rest in the same hand. This hand is now rehearsing, some are preparing to take the stage, some are waiting in the wings, and some are quietly leaving the hall. Rehearsal does not mean the play will change, but if it does, it teaches us which lines will be spoken on which stage. If read this way, the post-Russia era is not a nightmare but a manageable transition. If not read this way, the simplest mistake in the most unexpected place will result in the heaviest price to pay. And the only true summary of this entire text is this. No one wins alone. No one loses alone. Everyone prepares their own share. The share prepared today will write tomorrow's after. That is why the wisest thing to do today is to read the rehearsal script carefully. That is why we should now return to our first sentence. The streets are silent. The houses are calculating. The elite are busy. And the Kremlin, while managing today, is sitting in the shadow of tomorrow. As the shadow lengthens, the stage's light changes, IAA. And when the light changes, even if the names remain the same, Russia will be completely transformed. Thank you for watching.
We'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh.
The US is finally taking the clearest action for Ukraine.
But Mr. Trump said great progress had been made.
Mr. Putin, will you agree to a ceasefire?
We had an extremely productive meeting and many points were agreed to.
This new move is neither a transfer of weapons nor a ceasefire. It is a comprehensive security guarantee. Moreover, it is similar to the 5 points of NATO. This statement has been made so clearly for the first time by the US. Now the situation is very tense. The Ukrainian army is on the brink of collapse. But Europe and the US are rolling out a powerful new support formula. Leaders are flocking to Washington. Meanwhile, Putin is nervous, as the Russian army's ability to hold out under current conditions is dwindling. And Putin had an ironic meeting with Trump in Alaska. While Putin was greeted by the US military show in Alaska, he and Trump posed as if they were old friends. However, the images that emerged showed Trump with clear psychological superiority. Putin was welcomed with red carpets and the US presidential vehicle, but at the same time, F-22 fighter jets,
and B-2 bomber fleets were flying right in front of his eyes. In any case, this summit was truly a historic turning point, because after the Alaska meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, security guarantees were put on the table in a much tougher manner. So, will this promise really produce deterrence, or is it just an inadequate move? Volodymyr Zelensky is coming to Washington to seek the answer to this question. European leaders are joining him, indicating that the guarantee design will be shaped by the transatlantic anchor. A shift in Trump's rhetoric was also noted. The line, prioritizing a ceasefire, has given way to talk of a permanent agreement. This shift does not reduce tensions on the ground, but rearranges the agenda for negotiations. Putin's territorial demands in Donbas and Kiev's objection to them are setting the tone for tough negotiations. Can Article 5-like guarantees produce NATO influence without NATO membership? The answer to this question lies in the architecture of implementation. Let's start with the bare facts. The US envoy says that Russia has accepted that the US and its European allies will provide NATO-style protection to Ukraine. The statement implies that the decision is at the political principle level and that the details will be worked out in talks in Washington.
We agreed on much more robust security guarantees. The Russians agreed on enshrining legislatively.
The US's prepared message from Berlin also confirms the European side of the framework. On the Kiev front, the main red line is being maintained. Zelensky rejected the offer to hand over Donbas. This rejection requires that the guarantees be based on a model of deterrence while preserving territory, rather than territory in exchange for guarantees. So what could and could not be Article 5 like? First of all, this expression is not an exact copy of the collective defense provision in Article 5 of the NATO treaty. One cannot have automatic NATO obligations without being a NATO member. Therefore, what is being discussed is a non-NATO but NATO-compatible deterrence package. The first component of this set could be a rapid consultation and automatic support mechanism. The provision derived from the G7 framework, which states, consultation and provision of necessary support within 24 hours, is on the table as a legal template. The second component is to create a multi-layered umbrella for air and missile defense. This is possible with ground-based systems, airborne early warning, and network-centric command and control. The third component is a continuous flow of ammunition and spare parts. This requires guaranteed production capacity and advance purchase agreements. The fourth component is linking sanctions and financial deterrence to automatic triggers in a snapback style. If the attack resumes, energy and financial measures are automatically activated. The fifth component is direct investment and joint production in Ukraine's defense industry. This reduces the cost of the war and decreases dependence. The most controversial aspect of the package is how to define the threshold for military intervention. The key question is whether it should be indirect intervention, direct deployment of forces, or a scheme that includes both. Here, the fundamental difference that should not be confused with NATO becomes clear. NATO's Article 5 defines the principle of collective defense. In the case of the EU, however, partners determine the type and scale of their response according to their own domestic laws. Thus, bindingness is not automatic, but the political cost may become automatic. This is why the political balance in Washington is critical. The question of whether to opt for an agreement requiring Senate approval or a set of executive agreements is on the agenda. The executive format is fast but less durable. The agreement format is more binding but has a higher political threshold. This distinction in US domestic politics directly affects the credibility of deterrence. Rubio's emphasis on both sides having to make concessions indicates the political orientation as the package is being drafted. This rhetoric may not mean territorial concessions, but it points to a search for mutual steps in the text. The picture is becoming clearer on the European front. Chancellor Merz said he was ready to participate in US security guarantees, and Berlin's line appears to be in sync with Washington's. The fact that European leaders are accompanying Washington strengthens the image of a coalition and puts the brakes on Kiev being pushed into a lonely negotiation. The NATO line, however, is two-tiered. The alliance confirms that Ukraine's path to NATO remains open after the war. It sees bilateral security agreements as a bridge during the transition period. If the bridge is not built solidly, the parties will revert to old habits at the first sign of trouble.
How does Moscow read this picture? The first sign is the leaks from behind the scenes regarding the territory, NATO commitments, and sanctions easing, package after Alaska. According to the claims, while the demands for Donetsk and Luhansk continue, the withdrawal of the NATO application and the recognition of the de facto status of Crimea are being sought. Additionally, symbolic issues such as language and the church have been brought to the table. These are far below Kiev's threshold for acceptance and are politically unfeasible. A strong consensus has formed in Ukrainian politics, rejecting territorial concessions, and this position has been confirmed in public statements. Therefore, the only real meaning of the guarantees is the signal that if Russia attempts a new attack, the price will be paid by the big players. NATO's view is also divisive. The alliance's official line is that Ukraine's path to NATO membership should remain open in the post-war period. Similar guarantees do not replace NATO membership. They serve as a temporary bridge. Therefore, the text Washington will draft should be in a bridge commitment format. Let us move on to concrete steps. The first step is the trigger consultation clause, a condition for automatic assembly within 24 hours in the event of an attack or large-scale missile strike is stipulated. The second step is the automatic military supply switch. Once the defined threshold is crossed, air defense, long-range munitions, and electronic warfare packages are automatically dispatched. The third step is the continuous operation of the Common Air Picture and Integrated Air Missile Defense Network. This network is compatible with NATO, but operates separately from NATO's decision-making mechanism. The fourth step is pre-deployment and pre-stockpiling. Spare parts and ammunition depots are maintained at appropriate border points, and training continues on a rotational basis. The fifth step is automatic economic retaliation. In the event of a repeat attack, pre-programmed disruptors are activated in energy shipping and financial flows. The sixth step is the allocation of rehabilitation and reconstruction funds to defense civilian dual-use investments. This increases resilience and reduces costs. This scenario directly involves Europe's three heavyweights, the United Kingdom, Germany, and France, in the implementation phase. Regardless of the fate of the framework in Washington, the burden that the London, Berlin, Paris trio will bear in both military procurement and long-term financing is already clear. The United Kingdom expanded its aid items throughout 2025 on the basis of the UK-Ukraine Security Cooperation Agreement signed in 2024. According to an official information note, the goal is to ensure the continuity of the fighting force through training, air defense, long-range precision strikes, intelligence surveillance, and production partnerships. This acts as a resilience umbrella prior to NATO membership. Regardless of whether a Article 5-like formula emerges in Washington, London's policy apparatus is ready. Germany is decisive on two fronts. The first is the budget scale. Direct military aid and industrial orders allocated to Ukraine in the 2025 calendar have brought Germany close to becoming the #1 source of funding in Europe. Berlin is pursuing a clear production order strategy this year for Patriot architecture, air defense ammunition, armored platforms, and ammunition belts. The second is the financing technique. With the Pearl, Purchases for Ukraine by Replace and License mechanism announced on August 13th, Berlin has combined the methods of replacing every system that comes out of its own inventory with a new one, and direct supply from the manufacturer to Ukraine, in a pool, thereby accelerating the order replacement cycle. This provides a technical anchor for Europe's reflex to secure orders in the face of possible political turmoil in the US. France, meanwhile, entered 2025 in a more systematic manner through the bilateral security agreement signed in 2024 and the twin agreement concluded with Germany on the same day. The €3 billion package announced by Paris in 2024 is geared more toward air defense, cruise missiles, and artillery ammunition in 2025. The language of these agreements clearly reflects the intention to establish a binding guarantee regime in the short to medium term, while signaling NATO membership as the ultimate goal. Therefore, the dichotomy between NATO or guarantees is not read as either-or in Paris, but as a sequential ladder. Where is the line of concession? Is therefore a critical question. Two elements stand out here, pointing to a red line in practice. No territorial concessions will be imposed, and the ceasefire should not be a freeze that legitimizes Russian occupation lines. This interpretation has a ready counterpart in Europe, the G7 Joint Statement, which has been in effect since 2024, and its versions converted into bilateral agreements, repeatedly reiterate the phrase, Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Despite differences in tone between the London-Berlin-Paris trio, the line of no land concessions is shared. The fact that US officials left the door open to NATO-like guarantees and that European leaders gave their simultaneous support for this became clear at this very point. So what will the United Kingdom do? London is moving forward on two tracks. The first is to continue filling in the details of the bilateral agreement, securing stock and production slots for the second half of 2025 for Storm Shadow/Scalp class ammunition, air defense, training and maritime security. The second is to secure advanced ties to the US supply chain. The UK is accelerating joint projects with US manufacturers and moving toward a pre-financing and licensing approach that guarantees delivery despite the US domestic political rhythm. So, how is Germany aligning itself? Three messages stood out in Berlin's 2025 profile. First, the scale of aid and industrial capacity are being expanded together. Patriot, Iris-T, SLM, SLS, Jeopard ammunition, 155 mm production lines, and maintenance and repair stations are being managed as a single ecosystem. Second, the PURL model brings together the formulas of replacing the outgoing system with a new one, and direct supply through licensing under the same roof, creating structural speed, both closing Germany's own defense gap and ensuring serial flow to Ukraine. Third, political language. Although Berlin still says that NATO membership is difficult while the war is ongoing, it now views the idea of a security regime as a means of generating resilience. Merz's emphasis on part of the US guarantee in Washington is a sign of this transformation. Where does France fit into this formation? For Paris, the main equation is twofold. Part 1. Translating the bilateral agreement into action. Scalp EG flow, Crotal Mistral layers, Caesar execution, and new line orders. Part 2. Bringing Europe's strategic autonomy rhetoric into line with the security regime. Paris is defending a European core model that does not replace NATO but accelerates Ukraine. If Washington's line hardens, it calls for coordination. If it softens, it calls for resilience, not replacement. This flexibility is already present in the language of the bilateral agreement. So how are financing and sanctions taking shape? On the one hand, the EU's multi-year Ukraine facility, a package worth around €50 billion, is supporting Kyiv's macro-financial stability and reconstruction projects. On the other hand, new ideas such as weapons for debt aim to pre-commit European capital to US defense industry orders. When these two channels work together, European guarantees are placed under Washington's guarantee. In other words, the political text and the factory floor are brought onto the same page. On the sanctions front, the 18th package, closing back doors via Russia and Belarus, imposing a total transaction ban on certain banks, and expanding the scope of restricted technology items, functions as the financial arm of the guarantee debate. Policy notes summarizing Brussels' legal changes show that the transition from a messaging ban to a transaction ban directly cuts off commercial channels and introduces new powers for circulation export controls. Thus, while the guarantee promises military logistical speed, sanctions continuously raise the cost of supplies for the other side. This dual approach locks in two stages: deterrence plus cost imposition. So how does the EU-UK-Germany trio view the US position? The main idea is clear. Keep the US on board, place orders in advance, and align the legal language. Berlin's PURL model concretizes the Article 5-like trigger logic currently being discussed in Washington on the supply and production side. It establishes infrastructure for a missile air defense parts triad that will automatically kick in the event of a violation. Paris, meanwhile, is pairing the bilateral agreement with the European industrial chain to weave a framework that is strong with the US, sustainable alone. All of this looks strong on paper, but there are three critical risks. The first is the level of legal binding force. Executive agreements are vulnerable to government changes. The second is Europe's force allocation policy. Parliamentary approval processes can slow down the pace of rapid intervention. Third, Moscow's grey zone tactics. It may try to stay below the threshold with cyber, energy, and sabotage tactics. All three capitals know this. The political rhythm in Washington can change every year, but the order stock license triad produces an unchanging guarantee. These risks require that the automatic aspects of the guarantee be more clearly spelled out. Will an Article 5-like umbrella accelerate the path to NATO membership, Or will it turn it into a temporary parking lot? This is a matter that will be determined by the language and timelines of the text. Let's consider the implications on the ground. The permanence of medium and long-range layers in air defense reduces the effectiveness of Russian missile UAV pressure. The security of logistics lines increases, and industrial infrastructure suffers less damage. If the flow of long-range strike capabilities continues, deep supply and command nodes will be suppressed. A maritime security partnership in the Black Sea makes port traffic more predictable. The sum of these factors increases the cost of Moscow's playing for time strategy. For Moscow, the equation is simple. If the guarantee text produces automatic and concrete results in the event of a repeat attack, deterrence becomes real. If it contains only nice words, it will be tested. If tested, the political lifespan of the text will be shortened. Therefore, the degree of automaticity is the main bargaining chip in the talks in Washington. Europe's role is crucial here. If leaders who stand together politically also increase coordination in practice, the umbrella's wind resistance will increase. NATO, meanwhile, has two goals. One is to build a solid bridge for today. The second is to keep the path to membership open for tomorrow. Now let's look at the benefit-risk balance from Kiev's perspective. The benefit is the continuity of air defense and ammunition flows. This means protecting cities and allowing the front line to breathe. The benefit is that production partnerships will expand local capacity. This means less dependence on external shocks. The benefit is that the political umbrella will increase Moscow's cost calculations. This makes a new large-scale attack less rational. The risk is that the guarantee will remain empty. The Budapest feeling could generate new insecurity in society. The risk is that pressure for guarantees in exchange for territory will return. Zelensky's clear line of refusal is the main safeguard against this risk. The risk is that the NATO process will be postponed. The NATO line is clear for the post-war period, but deterrence must not be allowed to falter during this process. Europe's position on the line of concession. No territory, no freeze. It appears that European leaders entered the talks in Washington with the phrase Ukraine's territorial integrity, and that Zelensky clearly conveyed the message, "We will not surrender Donbas." This language is consistent with the logic of the guarantee regime of automatic response to violations. The debate is about methods and pace. Principles are not up for discussion. In terms of their view of the US, the UK is more optimistic aggressive, Germany more order-focused, and France emphasizes coordinated autonomy. None of the three find a security architecture separate from the US realistic, but they also do not want a scenario that is dependent on the US and relegates European industry to a secondary role. That is why the Article 5-like debate in Washington is gaining acceptance, while the Brussels-Berlin-Paris axis is keeping the order-stop-production triad in its own hands. This is how the balance is being established. The guarantee or NATO debate has moved beyond the either-or equation. Today's need is guarantee, automatic supply and speed. Tomorrow's need is NATO, permanent deterrence and political umbrella. The first is life support during the war, the second is insurance for the post-war period. The text in Washington is possible within the current political window, but Europe's lock on pre-financing and orders is inevitable. When these two pieces come together, Ukraine's options increase, and Moscow's dream of quick gains becomes costly once again. In short, Trump's shift from ceasefire to permanent agreement both challenges and strengthens Kiev's hand. It challenges because it creates pressure for concrete results in the short term. It strengthens because Europe's open support carries weight at the table. Moscow, meanwhile, will seek to gain diplomatic legitimacy. These initiatives make the text of the guarantees even more critical. NATO's strategic outlook will continue to confirm the post-war membership line. This confirmation emphasizes the temporary nature of the similar umbrella and points to the long-term framework. Do you think Washington can draft the text at a level that cannot be tested this time? The first feedback from the field will provide the answer. We will continue to closely monitor the numbers, headlines, and steps in this process. We look forward to your comments. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for new analyses. Thank you for watching. Russia once again relied on its armor. But this time, it faced not just a defensive line, but a calculated ambush. A massive Russian armored convoy of 71 vehicles was advancing toward Syrskyi. Inside were tanks, armored personnel carriers, motorcycle reconnaissance units, and fast strike teams. All were deployed to the battlefield, but Russian commanders failed to account for one thing. The 54th and 81st Brigades were waiting exactly where they were supposed to be. What happened next? On July 27th, Russian forces had gathered near the village of Kamianske. 6 T-72B3M tanks, arranged in 3 rows, 3 BMP-2 armored personnel carriers, 6 MT-LB tracked tractors, 1 BEM recovery vehicle, 2 light buggies, and 12 pickup trucks linked together began moving forward. 41 motorcycles were also at the rear of the convoy. The Russian convoy's intention was to launch a surprise attack towards Zolotarivka, first catching the Ukrainian defense off guard, then pushing back the western flank surrounding Syrskyi. But this time, they were not facing an ordinary defense line. Ukraine's 54th Mechanized Brigade and 81st Airborne Brigade had been preparing in the area for weeks. The convoy's route had been identified beforehand, and a series of drone surveillance points and artillery coordination networks had been set up in the area. The 54th Brigade had been defending this front, which had seen some of the fiercest fighting in the region since 2022. They knew the terrain and the enemy's habits like the back of their hands. The 81st Brigade, meanwhile, was renowned for its rapid response, high mobility, and flanking maneuvers. 2 T-64BV tanks from the 81st Air Assault Brigade approached the northern edge of the riverbed and took up positions in the shade. An M113 armored ambulance was parked beside them. As soon as the Russian convoy emerged from the tree line, reconnaissance drones had already taken up positions on the hilltop. As soon as movement was detected, the first salvo arrived with 155mm artillery fire. The Ukrainian tank commander then locked onto a sudden heat signature detected by his thermal imaging system. About 90 meters away, a Russian armored vehicle was slowly emerging from between the trees. Its hull was heavily reinforced with anti-drone grills. This was a T-72B3 with improvised armor enhancements. To protect the approximately 46-ton T-72 and its 3-person crew, the grills were welded to the upper structure, along with additional steel panels. The armor protection was reinforced with composite armor and Contact 5 explosive reactive armor systems. While this reinforcement aimed to protect it from airborne FPV attacks, this time death would come not from the sky, but from the barrel of the opposing gun. The Ukrainian sniper quickly made his calculations. The T-64BV's 125mm gun was loaded with a heat round. The Russian tank's blind spot was the dome area at the rear left, where there was no armor reinforcement. After a moment of silence, the trigger was pulled. The shell struck the Russian tank's upper structure, directly beneath the turret. At the moment of the explosion, the turret was thrown aside, and the turret itself jumped half a meter upward. However, the fatal blow was not this. Despite the severe shock, the vehicle managed to maneuver backward by forcing its engine. The damage was critical, but the crew was still inside. The Russian tank could only reach a speed of 50 kilometers per hour on the difficult terrain. The Ukrainian drones, however, were much faster. Within minutes, the drone team lying in ambush on the hilltop released an FPV drone loaded with explosives. The drone flew over the trees and headed toward the Russian tank in the burning forest. It embedded itself in the rear armor and exploded. This second blow ignited the fuel tank. The T-72B3 turned into a ball of flames. Since the ammunition was being transported openly in the automatic loader inside the tank, the fire could not be extinguished. In the panic, some vehicles tried to retreat but became stuck in the narrow path within the forest. FPV drones were waiting for this opportunity. Kamikaze drones, first targeting the tank turrets and then the engine blocks of the BTRs, shattered the armored line within minutes. However, Ukraine's plan did not end there. The convoy had been stopped. Now it was time for destruction. The 81st Brigade's light infantry units launched an attack along the armored line at a 3/4 angle. At this point in the battle, the Russian side's plan should have been to gain momentum. They couldn't do that either. The reason was the breakdown of logistics. The BREM recovery vehicle accompanying the convoy was preparing to tow the first damaged tank when 2 more FPVs closed in on it. The driver's door was shattered, and the crane operator was injured. With no team left to rescue the tank, the convoy's speed dropped once again. Thus, the Russian soldiers, surrounded from the sides and rear, were left defenseless in open terrain. They were not given the opportunity to reposition themselves through quick maneuvers and coordinated fire. Russian infantry disembarking from transport vehicles encountered mini-mortar fire, automatic rifles, and homemade explosives before they could even dig in. Some armored vehicles were abandoned in the forest because their equipment had malfunctioned or the crew had been lost. Just a few minutes after the fighting began, at least 5 Russian tanks lined up side by side in an open area at the edge of the forest caught fire simultaneously. All that remained were thick black smoke, the echoes of exploding ammunition, and intertwined piles of metal. Tank turrets were hurled meters away. Some vehicles' ammunition depots exploded from within. Within the first 45 minutes, at least 20 armored vehicles were rendered inoperable by coordinated fire from Ukrainian artillery and FPV drone teams. Tanks, BMP-2s, armored personnel carriers and most motorized units were either destroyed by fire or abandoned. Russian units attempting to advance along the narrow forest strip, now under a no-fly zone, were repeatedly detected and subjected to sudden fire. Satellite imagery clearly revealed extensive burn marks, ammunition fragments, and traces of secondary explosions at various points in the area. Tree trunks remained charred and broken, while the ground was littered with craters caused by large-caliber artillery shells. The number of Russian military vehicles left behind after the battle was staggering. Only 1 BREM armored recovery vehicle, 1 MTLB personnel carrier, and 1 truck remained operational. They were later withdrawn from the area while being monitored by Ukrainian surveillance drones. According to initial estimates, 48 Russian soldiers were neutralized at the scene, while 69 others were injured to varying degrees. Most of the wounded were either pulled from the rubble or found defenseless near the exploding vehicles. Even the basic numbers of this clash demonstrated how the war economy had been turned upside down. The Russian army spent months laying mines and traps in critical areas and passageways, but Ukraine used unimaginable tactics to blow Putin's traps up in his face. Using the enemy's traps against them required great coordination, intelligence, and tactical awareness. In this context, on August 2nd, Ukrainian forces carried out a demolition operation that looked like something out of a military thriller. The incident was highly dramatic for the Russian army. This is because the Russians had placed TM-62 anti-tank mines on the bridge over the Tartar River. They had prepared to blow up the bridge in the event of a Ukrainian attack in the Bryansk region. They hung nets and set traps to protect the bridge. And in the event of a possible Ukrainian ambush, the Russians would press the button as Ukrainian troops crossed the bridge. But moments later, a Ukrainian FPV drone pilot, using a fiber optic connection, skillfully overcame all obstacles, accurately hit the Russian mines, and blew up the bridge. The strike asset selected for the bridge in Bryansk was a carbon fiber-bodied, FPV-controlled, 3 to 4 kilograms class kamikaze drone. The 400 to 500 grams of explosive material placed in the front section of the body was insufficient to detonate directly. Nearly 30 TM-62 anti-tank mines were placed under the bridge to block Ukrainian advances. These Soviet-made mines, with steel bodies carrying 7 to 8 kilograms of TNT, had the power to shatter a tank's underside. Under normal circumstances, these mines would be activated either by a mechanical trigger system or by remote detonation. But this time, Ukraine started the chain reaction. However, when it struck with precision, it was powerful enough to create a shockwave that would trigger one of the TM-62 anti-tank mines inside the steel console holding the bridge. The TM-62 contains 7 to 8 kilograms of TNT in its body, and the pressure exerted on its fusion element triggers the mine. The chain reaction anticipated by the Ukrainian planners began precisely here. When a single mine detonated, all the other mines embedded in the bridge's structure exploded one after another. In total, an energy equivalent to nearly 250 kilograms of TNT was released. The concrete pavement layer, along with the steel beams, was lifted several meters into the air before shattering and scattering into the Tartar River and its surroundings. According to eyewitness accounts, an area with a radius of 100 meters was nearly completely transformed into craters and debris after the explosion. In footage shared on social media, the FPV drone can be clearly seen gliding at low altitude, then locking onto its target and colliding with its support leg, followed by the start of a destructive chain reaction explosion a few seconds later.
With the explosion, the drone camera goes dark, and then a column of flames rising into the sky is reflected in the camera. As a thick layer of smoke rises in the area, only charred metal pieces and blackened concrete blocks remain of the bridge. With the collapse of the bridge, evacuation and support links for Russian troops stationed along a 16-kilometer border strip have been completely cut. The explosion destroyed not only a passageway, but also Russia's confidence in its border defense line. But don't think that an ordinary target was destroyed. This was a Russian defense hub that had been carefully prepared not only from an engineering standpoint, but also on a tactical level. The basis of this operation is Ukraine's drone doctrine, which has been maturing in the field. Kiev has abandoned its Soviet-era, heavy industry-based defense concept and perfected the low-cost, high-impact formula with cheap, agile, and smart platforms. According to OSINT sources close to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, the troops serving in this region are currently effectively trapped behind Ukraine's front lines. So why did Russia set such a trap for itself? The reflex to protect the border was based on the buffer corridor doctrine, officially announced by Moscow in the fall of 2023. Under this doctrine, a series of fixed defense lines were built along the Bryansk, Belgorod, and Kursk regions. The main goal was to stop possible Ukrainian ground attacks before they reached the border and to create a defensive depth within Russian territory. To this end, anti-tank trenches were dug for miles, minefields were laid, concrete blocks were used to create barriers, and remote-controlled explosive devices were placed under strategic bridges. But this defensive architecture also had a weakness. The geographical structure of the region was extremely limited in terms of alternative passages and logistical flexibility. Concrete bridges built over natural obstacles, such as the Tata River, served not only a tactical, but also a strategic lifeline function. These bridges were indispensable, not only for the passage of military convoys, but also for the advance of armored units, the transport of ammunition and fuel, evacuation routes, and even basic lines to rear logistics centers. The bridge over the Tata was an absolute choke point due to the inadequacy of the surrounding infrastructure. The dirt roads to the south were muddy during the summer months due to sudden rains, making it impossible for heavy transport vehicles to pass. The forest cover to the north consisted of narrow, sloping slopes, unsuitable for armored vehicles. Therefore, the destruction of the Tata Bridge eliminated not only a transport line, but also the main supply and evacuation corridor for all Russian forces in the region. How Ukraine achieved this cannot be explained by simply flying a drone. First came the intelligence step. Both satellite imagery and frontline intelligence sources were used to map the mine configuration in the area. Civilian-looking, fixed-wing surveillance drones recorded military traffic between the bridge's entrance and exit for a week. Video analytics revealed the times when fuel tankers and armored personnel carriers passed through. Heat map analysis identified the traces of excavation activities carried out by Russian excavators at the bridge's foundation, which helped determine the timing of mine laying. Signal intelligence then came into play, since Russian engineering units used low-power RF firing modules to remotely trigger TM62 mines. Electromagnetic interference patterns were observed in the area. Interference windows confirmed the geographical distribution of the mine array. The final attack plan was drawn up, assuming that there were 3 main drive points on the northwestern leg of the bridge and 1 on the southeastern leg. The target was the corner leg, where at least 2 mines would trigger each other. The FPV drone, equipped with a limited explosive charge, locked onto this leg. The drone's final maneuver, lasting 10 seconds, was designed to move parallel to the ground and then suddenly climb upward, causing the body to strike the underside of the bridge girder. One important detail to note is that the bridge has been designated a red zone by Russian troops since the first year of the war. There are unmanned surveillance towers and thermal cameras, but most of the night vision algorithms are focused on tracking trucks and vehicles that give off high heat signatures. With its composite carbon body, electric motor, and minimal IR signature, the FPV drone was almost impossible to detect on Russian surveillance screens. When the flight speed reached 120 kilometers an hour, the detection window dropped to 2 or 3 seconds.
a very short window for a human operator to react, activate an RF jammer, or relay orders to a drone defense artillery unit. When considering why Russia couldn't prevent this, three answers emerge. First, the mine network laid under the bridge falls under the passive defense category. While the mine is under the bridge, the RF trigger cannot be jammed with interference because the activation sensor is triggered by mechanical vibration when the drone collides with it. Second, Russian electronic warfare capabilities were weak near the bridge. EW teams were deployed deeper into the front lines to protect critical radar domes in Belgorod and Kursk. This rural area of Bryansk was primarily a transit point for ground convoys. Air defense was a low priority. Third, the Russian army adopted a modular corridor approach instead of a comprehensive surveillance network, so sensor data does not flow to a simultaneous command center. Each bridge is under the responsibility of a separate unit. Different regiments carry different EW codes. In such fragmented networks, opening a window for rapid reaction is nearly impossible. Looking at the impact of the attack on the front lines, logistical delays are already being felt. Russia was moving an average of 300 tons of fuel and ammunition per day through Bryansk before the bridge was destroyed. In the first 48 hours after the explosion, shipments fell to almost zero. Alternative routes offer two different bypasses, via Klintsy in the north and around Starodub in the south. But both routes are longer and have been marked as sensitive areas since previous Ukrainian drone attacks. The first figures included in ISW's daily Frontline report indicate that approximately 5 Russian units have shifted positions along the Bryansk border under the pretext of a tactical withdrawal. In reality, this is not a withdrawal, but an inability to hold positions due to supply shortages. If the fuel convoy cannot arrive, the 6 soldiers inside the BMP-3 cannot maintain the fire support line. When ammunition trucks are delayed, it becomes impossible to defend 122mm artillery positions with AK-74 rifle fire. The psychological impact is even more intense. Russia frequently uses the concept of a deep rear in its propaganda. Regions close to Moscow, key bridges behind the front lines, and major railway junctions are claimed to be under absolute protection, out of reach of Ukrainian drones. The destruction of bridges has undermined this claim. Images shared on Russian social media by relatives of soldiers show not only bridge debris but also armored convoys diverted onto side roads. The question, "Why are our mines exploding on us?" has been trending on social media. The economic impact extends beyond Bryansk. The bridges in the border region are the arteries of the north-south logistics axis stretching from the Caucasus to St. Petersburg. When this route is cut off, additional strain is placed on railway traffic between Rostov and Donbas. Railway transportation accounts for 70% of Russia's total military logistics. The destruction of a bridge may seem like a minor setback at the macro level, but if we consider the series of events that took place at the same time, with oil depots burning in Sochi, a tanker station being hit in Volgograd, and a fuel train exploding on the Rostov-Salsk line, the cost multiplier grows. While the cost per UAV ranges from $5,000 to $25,000, repairing a concrete bridge can cost $4 million to $5 million. When multiplied by fuel supply delays and armored repair bills, the damage adds up to a staggering figure. The attack also stands out as a textbook example of Kiev's deep strike logistics disruption strategy. This strategy is based on a 3-tiered attack architecture. The first layer consists of low-cost but high-impact continuous drone attacks. FPV and fixed-wing kamikaze UAVs are sent in waves to targets behind the front lines. These attacks are often carried out with decoy UAVs to confuse air defenses and force them to overreact. As a result, the Russian defense system becomes unable to distinguish which threats are real. The second layer is the precision strike phase, where high-precision guided munitions come into play. Western systems such as JDAM-ER, Storm Shadow, and Scalp EG target critical infrastructure such as radar towers, fuel tanks, bridges, and command centers. The third layer consists of electronic warfare-supported signal jamming operations. Jamming systems such as Nemesis, Bukovel, and Thor in Ukraine's inventory blind the radars of Russian surface-to-air missile batteries, facilitating the previous 2 layers' targets. This 3-tiered structure was applied exactly in the attack on the bridge over the Tsata River in Bryansk. Electronic warfare assets near the Ukrainian border prevented Russian EW units from tracking the drone's routes and taking countermeasures.
The FPV drone then targeted Russian anti-tank mines placed directly on the bridge's support columns. The force of the explosion came from both the munitions and the chain reaction. The invisible aspect of the operation is the drone technology itself. Several Ukrainian startup companies have produced semi-artificial intelligence control software for FPV drones. The operator manually flies the drone until the final approach. In the last 15 meters, the internal LiDAR and optical matching systems kick in. The artificial neural network identifies the weakest point of the bridge's structure and sends a confirmation signal to the pilot. This minimizes factors such as signal delay and wind drift. No matter how small the target, the drone hits its final point, known as the laser, with millimeter precision. In Russian defense doctrine, countering this is only possible with hard-kill cannons or high-energy lasers. However, Russia's Pantsir S-1 batteries experience delays when firing 30mm cannon shells even if they detect a 1kg FPV drone, and if the detection-to-fire window is less than 2 seconds, the artillery response cannot keep up. High-energy lasers are still in the prototype stage. This technological asymmetry is directly reflected in Putin's image. The most critical component of the military modernization narrative that the Kremlin has been building for years is air defense. Platforms such as the S-400 Triumph, Pantsir, Tor M2 and Baikal radar were lined up like decorations in parades. Now, images of FPV drones costing a few $1,000s slipping through the S-400's blind spot and disrupting Russia's own mine system are undermining the Triumph narrative on the ground. What is devastating for the Russian public is not so much the magnitude of the loss as the fact that the trap has backfired on its creator. The long-term equation that will result from the bridge destruction may force Russia to question its mine trench defense doctrine. When combined with the bridge, the mine protecting the shelter becomes a potential bomb ready to explode. Moscow will either reduce the number of mines. This will open the way for Ukrainian ground forces, or else a bridge system with more steel-plated mines will be needed, which will increase costs and extend construction time. The rule of military engineering that protection, if it lacks flexibility, backfires, is being added as a footnote to Russia's Bryansk lesson. Finally, we must address Putin's political image. A regime that bases its legitimacy on the strategic control myth must rewrite its narrative when it loses a bridge due to its own mine plan. Let's end with a pertinent question. If the Kremlin's mine explodes on the border bridge, who will defend the watchtowers in Moscow? Public perception is embracing the narrative of disaster rather than explaining the failure. Russian history is familiar with the smell of gunpowder from military mistakes, from the Afghanistan trauma to the Chechnya fiasco. But this time, the mistake is not exploding on the front lines, but in the backyard. The smell of gunpowder at home is too strong to be suppressed by any propaganda. The destroyed bridge in Bryansk is not just a pile of concrete and steel. It is a living monument to the defeat of a costly legacy of defense by a wave of cheap and clever attacks in the old-new war equation. Ukraine made Russia pay for this with an FPV drone. Russia fell into the trap it had set by laying mines. The war will continue, but now everyone knows that the side that can bomb the red lines on the map, not on the battlefield, will win the game. Thank you for watching.
Russia's southern front plans were thrown into disarray by a single bombing order. The Ukrainian Air Force destroyed a vital border crossing in Zaporizhia, with JDAM-ER bombs dropped from MiG-29s. This crossing was not just a bridge, it was the military backbone connecting Crimea, Mariupol, and Dnipro. Now that backbone has been broken. Munition shipments have stopped. Fuel convoys have been cut off. The Kremlin's summer offensive collapsed before it even began. Can Russia compensate for this setback? On July 7, a Ukrainian MiG-29 fighter jet targeted a vital Russian crossing point over the Karachukrak River in the Zaporizhia region. This bridge was no ordinary structure. Although not the main branch of the Dnipro River, it served as a key link in the Russian army's supply chain on the southern front. Heavy fuel tankers, trucks loaded with ammunition, and armored repair convoys regularly cross this crossing every day, feeding the logistics line stretching from Tokmak to Melitopol, and from there to Crimea via Kinburn. This route, considered an alternative to the Kerch Bridge, was critical for the transfer of cargo to eastern ports in particular. In the spring, Russia built a temporary but structurally sound military bridge over the Karachukrak to reinforce this route. Supported by concrete slabs, this structure allowed heavy vehicles to safely cross the marshy ground. An average of 230 vehicles used this route daily, with 1/3 of them directly supplying ammunition to the front lines.
The remaining transportation handled fuel and food logistics. This is precisely why Ukraine did not hesitate in its target selection. The attack was not a conventional air operation, but was carried out using 2 GBU-62 bombs, equipped with advanced JDAM-ER guidance kits. These bombs were modernized versions of the US-produced 1,000-pound Mk-83. Thanks to the GPS-guided kit added to the tail section and the deployed flaps, these bombs can reach a range of over 70 kilometers and hit targets with accuracy of just a few meters. Normally, Soviet-designed MiG-29s were not equipped with the necessary interface to use these bombs, but Ukraine introduced Western munitions to these aircraft with a special adaptation kit developed in Lviv. The pilot can now see the range and targeting data of NATO-inventoried smart weapons on the cockpit display. This transforms an old jet into a modern precision strike platform. As a result of the attack, the temporary military bridge was completely disabled. One of the factors that made the attack so effective was not only the precision of the munitions used, but also the systematic air defense suppression operation carried out prior to the operation. In particular, the Russian Army's Buk-M2 medium-range air defense systems deployed in the region were disabled by successive suppression of enemy air defenses attacks in recent weeks. Despite having an effective radar lock range of up to 45 kilometers, these systems were either detected and destroyed or rendered blind due to their radar frequencies being jammed. As a result, Ukraine's MiG-29s were able to advance through an open-air corridor as they approached the range to launch JDAM-ER bombs. The second and less talked-about effect of the operation was not limited to the destruction of the bridge. This bridge was not just a crossing point, it also served as a buffer zone, masking the logistics hub of the Russian 35th Corps on the eastern bank. Hidden behind the fog of war, this staging area was now exposed and vulnerable. Satellite imagery and heat signature data indicate that smoke rose from 3 separate camp areas shortly after the attack. This likely indicates secondary explosions in ammunition or fuel depots. Following the attack, the eastern ramp of the bridge was completely collapsed into the sea, with concrete blocks blocking the inner roadway. This structural collapse not only stopped traffic, but also wiped Russia's critical supply route from Mariupol to Crimea off the map. They now have to detour from Tokmak to Berdyansk to reach the east of the Dnipro. But this new route means an additional 160 kilometers and a loss of time. Moreover, this secondary route is extremely unfavorable in terms of both geography and infrastructure. Consisting of a narrow strip of earth, this passage quickly turns to mud, especially during summer rains. In such conditions, heavy fuel trucks could get stuck on the road, with their wheels sinking into the mud. This is not merely a physical disruption, but a collapse of the logistics chain. Because the fuel needed to reach the tank's tank is being used to charge a satellite phone, used to call for a crane. On the military side, another panic has emerged. After the bridge was hit, Ukraine demonstrated that its long-range JDAM-ER munitions could easily strike the rear of the front lines, forcing the Russian Air Force to respond urgently. Su-30 SM fighter jets were moved to the vicinity of Melitopol, and day and night patrol flights were launched on the Vasilivka-Melitopol line. But these aircraft cannot fly above 4,000 meters to avoid entering the radar range of Ukraine's Patriot systems, which are equipped with AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles. This limits both their field of view and their attack position. There are patrol flights, but there is no real threat of a raid or suppression. The S-400 air defense batteries are scattered in a rather haphazard manner against this new threat. According to data obtained from satellite images, these batteries are mounted on temporary ramps that are constantly being moved rather than being placed in fixed positions. The aim is to prevent the destruction of all radar and command units with a single hit. This portability brings with it another problem. The radars cannot operate at the optimum altitude. In addition, Russian defense forces have deployed CRBN masking systems to make it more difficult for JDAM-ER munitions to target them. These systems reduce visibility by deflecting radar signals rather than suppressing them, but this appears to have seriously slowed down coordination and the chain of command on the ground. The impact of the attack has been much deeper and more multifaceted than meets the eye. With the bridge out of commission, the Russian command realized that it could not reinforce its front lines in Mariupol with BMP-3 armored vehicles, which were running on low fuel reserves. With the road link cut off, the solution shifted to air transport. The first reflex was to deploy Il-76 military transport aircraft. These flights via Kerch carried spare engine parts, sets of tracks, and emergency ammunition. But this method created two major problems. First, large targets such as the Il-76 are very easy to detect by Western radar systems, which means that the risk of air defense is immediately sky high. The second is economic. Each ton transported by Il-76 costs 3 times as much as the same load transported by truck. The cargo carried by Russia's logistics network on its southern front is no longer limited to ammunition and fuel. The Ministry of Agriculture's seasonal supply line from Donbas to Crimea has also been directly affected. Trucks traveling along this route transported grain, vegetables, meat products and milk to food warehouses in Crimea, returning with empty pallets, crates and waste packaging. But the destruction of the temporary bridge over the Karachakrak disrupted the two-way flow of this route. In particular, large refrigerated trailers are now forced to take a 160-kilometer detour via Berdyansk as an alternative route. Fuel consumption for trucks on this new route has nearly doubled. Logistics companies can no longer afford these extra costs. Many subcontractors have started to report losses. Civilian suppliers are directly sending invoices to the government, stating, "If prices on the shelves in Crimea do not increase by 18%, we cannot cover these costs."
Russia is a country at war, but it is not only fighting against Ukraine, it is also fighting within itself. The economy has hit rock bottom, and the resources to cover the costs of the war have been exhausted. Soldiers on the front lines are struggling to find food, and shortages of ammunition and equipment are growing. Russians are now on the brink of a major uprising, saying enough is enough, while the Kremlin is turning to exploiting even the poorest regions to fill the budget. Growing unrest in the streets is turning into rebellion. Explosions are not just lighting up Moscow's skyline, but also burning television screens miles away. In Rostov, angry mothers set fire to the military commissariat. In Kazan, protests against electricity price hikes turned into "No to War" slogans. And in Dagestan villages, a flood of coffins triggered calls for autonomy. Even the refrigerators of the low-income class in Buryatia have been seized by the army. The situation is that dire, and this is pushing Russia into the darkest period of its modern history. The deafening sound of sirens echoing across the country is no longer connecting the Kremlin to the streets. It is connecting the streets to each other. Every alarm sounds like a drumbeat of rebellion. Every explosion further eroding the myth of the invincible state. Where will this chain of collapse break? In the 8th month of 2025, the Kremlin budget had a deficit of 3.7 trillion rubles. This figure represents a budget gap of a magnitude almost unheard of in Russian financial history outside of times of war. As the cost of the war in Ukraine rises with each passing month, military spending is skyrocketing. Energy revenues are declining due to global price fluctuations and sanctions. The ruble, meanwhile, cannot stop its decline in value. Thus, Moscow's coffers are emptying rapidly, struggling to bear the burden of the war. The Kremlin's solution to close this gap has been to reach into the pockets of citizens at the lowest levels of society. Buryatia, one of Siberia's poorest regions, already has a fragile socio-economic structure with low income levels, limited production capacity, and high unemployment rates. But in recent weeks, local authorities and volunteer networks have launched campaigns to collect supplies directly from the public to support the army. Announcements made in the Syrskyi region requested donations of refrigerators to be sent to field hospitals at the front lines. However, the list of requests quickly expanded to include basic humanitarian needs, such as motorcycles, clothing, wheelchairs, canes, and even drinking water. A small number of people voluntarily handed over their remaining working refrigerators and other usable items. But this scene attracted attention not only because of the material aid it provided, but also because of the message it conveyed. Local residents interpret the state and military's inability to meet even the most basic logistical needs with their own resources as a sign of deep failure in both economic management and war preparedness. The situation in Buryatia is being replicated almost exactly in other regions of Russia. In Irkutsk, the local administration suspended bonus payments to a wide range of people, from teachers to cultural workers, public officials and educators, and transferred these funds directly to the army's needs. Although official statements say that these cuts are temporary, there is talk behind the scenes that they could continue indefinitely. A teacher's account clearly illustrates the scale of the situation. They said there was no money left for the SWO, that all resources had been exhausted. Since soldiers couldn't be paid, they deducted a significant amount from our salaries. In the Komi Republic, demands have taken a different turn. Authorities have requested that the public donate fishing nets to be sent to the front lines. It is stated that soldiers will use these nets to cover trenches, build temporary shelters, or provide camouflage. Thus, the assistance requested from the public is not limited to basic needs such as food or clothing. It extends to engineering and defense materials that will be used directly on the battlefield. At Bauman State Technical University in Moscow, the impact of the war economy has manifested itself in a more creative but equally controversial way. The university administration has offered students physical education credits in exchange for knitting camouflage nets. This practice amounts to a direct exchange of academic achievement for the production of war materials. Thus, the needs of the front lines are now being met not only by factories or volunteer workshops, but also by university campus curricula. What is striking is that the increasing economic and social pressures have completely transformed the public's motivation to donate. Those who enthusiastically supported the invasion of Ukraine in the early stages of the war and sent money to the front lines had increased their donations nearly fourfold by 2025. But this time, the driving force was not Kremlin propaganda, but the harsh conditions and humanitarian concerns faced by soldiers on the front lines. In other words, the purpose of donations has become less about supporting a political cause and more about helping relatives, friends, or neighbors survive. However, even this voluntary aid is far from solving the deepening problem. The people see that the cost of the war is constantly being placed on their shoulders as their living standards rapidly decline. Prices for everything from basic food items to transportation are rising, while wages are eroding in real terms. Public services such as health and education are deteriorating, and transportation infrastructure is crumbling. This situation is fueling growing silent anger and unrest, especially in low-income areas. Moreover, this anger is not solely driven by material concerns. Mothers who send their children to war also bear the heavy burden of financing this war. In Dagestan, where soldiers' funerals followed one after another, meetings were held under the banner of local autonomy, and the issue was quickly brought to the official agenda of the regional parliament. In Tatarstan, an imam said in his sermon, "If the capital declares war and sends the bill to the peasants, this is not justice." As a result, an investigation was launched against him by the Ethnic Policy Committee. Every time budget allocations are cut, discontent grows in the provinces. When the center's power weakens, the periphery becomes reluctant to recognize authority. The anger on the streets erupted in Novosibirsk at the end of July. 3,800 people who participated in the Enough is Enough march were dispersed within the first 15 minutes by water cannons firing colored water. Memorial chains were formed in 19 cities with black balloons in their hands and the slogan, "Give me back my son," on their lips. In Perm, crowds protesting a 25% increase in the price of bread quickly switched to chanting, "No to war." Police offered those arrested two options: a fine of 600,000 rubles or voluntary deployment to the front lines. Finding men without passports in the city was nearly impossible. Most had left the country months earlier via Georgia or Kazakhstan. The losses were no longer just statistics, they had become a pain deeply embedded in people's homes. According to independent sources, the number of Russian soldiers killed, seriously injured, or missing between February 2022 and July 2025 reached 1.05 million. This meant that 1 in every 4 households in the country had a black ribbon hanging from their door. According to a report by demographer Pavel Yelizarov, between 970,000 and 1,040,000 soldiers had completely lost their combat effectiveness during the same period. While official figures still insisted on 45,000 casualties, the reality of the graves was undeniable. The Independent Civil Initiative last address identified 132,000 new military grave markers ordered between April and June, based on data from marble workshops. This equated to an average of 1,450 deaths per day. Local newspapers in villages now print obituaries on extra pages, while in cities the question, "Why the war?" is spray-painted on neighborhood walls. While state television broadcast headlines about heroic defenders of the homeland, mothers on Telegram still whispered the same words. The zinc box arrived, we couldn't see his face. Nevertheless, 350,000 people were called up in an accelerated draft to make up for the new losses. But the confirmed number did not even reach 50,000. Instead of long queues in front of the provincial police headquarters, there are silent voids. Young people rush from the passport line to the Georgian border, the Mongolian steppe, or the Helsinki bus station. According to reports, over the past 9 months, 310,000 conscripts have crossed the borders of Georgia, Finland, Kazakhstan, and Turkey, illegally. Mobile border data shows that 22% of Russian citizens intend to leave the country. It is now the norm for families to wait at the door with their passports, cash, and digital wallets at the ready. An anonymous report from border guards says that over 120,000 people have declared their intention to leave the country permanently since the end of May. This brings the total number of war refugees to 1.3 million. The defense industry cannot find workers to replace the young men who have left, leaving production lines idle. The official unemployment rate still stands at just 7.3%, but this figure masks the employment illusion created by the war. The recruitment of military contract personnel has topped the list of most sought-after professions in Russia's open labor market database for the first time. Salary promises of up to 500,000 rubles are splashed across posters to lure young people from poor regions into the barracks. But for those who know the truth, these advertisements are often synonymous with two signs seen side by side on the same street. One is a banner recruiting soldiers, the other is an advertisement for a coffin manufacturer. In the civilian sector, the picture is even bleaker. The disruption of the supply chain for Western technology components has crippled production. In the past month alone, 1,100 medium-sized factories have closed down. The 68,000 people laid off in the automotive sector formed long lines in front of tax offices. Applications for temporary social credit hit a record high. The consumer front is also experiencing a severe downturn. In the neighborhood markets of the Leningrad Oblast, the price of a kilogram of potatoes has reached 90 rubles. Pensioners are calculating whether they can afford to buy bread when they go to the pharmacy to get their prescription drugs. The subsidized smart credit card project, which the government has begun to talk about, is being described as a QR code version of the coupon books of the 1990s. The crisis is not limited to income and consumption. The country's skilled human resources are also rapidly dwindling. Since the beginning of June, 47 rural health centers have hung signs saying, "Temporarily closed," due to a shortage of doctors. In some areas, the nearest dental clinic is 300 kilometers away, and a farmer writhing in toothache expresses his anger, saying, "Did I not have my teeth pulled to win the war?" Middle-class families are paying large sums of rubles to consulting firms operating along the Turkey-Armenia-Serbia route to send their children abroad. Demographic indicators are revealing one of the harshest reflections of social collapse. The birth rate dropped by 7% in 2024. In the first quarter of 2025, the decline reached 12%. Reports from maternity clinics confirm that expectant mothers are unwilling to raise children in an environment of economic uncertainty and social unrest. Thus, the economic crisis is quietly consuming not only the present, but also the future of the country. The wave of emigration is no longer just the desperate flight of the poor. The richest segment of the country is also quietly packing their bags. As always, the elite made the first move. Oligarchs are withdrawing their assets from Russia by transferring them to Dubai-based offshore trusts. In the last 3 months, $15 billion has fled abroad unregistered. Luxury villas in Rublevka have fallen to half their price on real estate portals, but the market is still frozen. No one wants to tie their fortune to a house burning with rubles. The central bank is issuing warning after warning saying, "You are disrupting the balance of payments." But these warnings are not affecting the appetite of law firms or the determination of buyers. Deals are being struck behind the scenes, synchronized with private jet departure times. In the corridors of the capital, the same phrase is being whispered more and more frequently. If the ruble hits 160, even those who stayed will start looking for tickets. But after the attacks in June, 117,000 passports were issued in just 1 month. Queues of vehicles at the Georgian border crossed 35 kilometers. Kazakhstan limited entries by imposing quotas on authorization visas. Even Armenia began discussing a cap on temporary residence applications on the grounds of preserving the male population balance. Andrei, 28, who left Barnaul, explained his decision in a short video posted on YouTube. "If I stay here, there are two possibilities, the front or prison. Exile is expensive, but if there is a price to pay for survival, I have chosen to pay it." All these developments are severely eroding the political image that Vladimir Putin has worked so hard to cultivate over the years. This is because Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine, which began in 2022, was presented as a historic mission and rebirth of the nation, thanks to the Kremlin's skillful propaganda in the early days. Victory songs were played on state television and Russian flags waved in the squares. But as time passed, the cost of the war became visible both on the front lines and within the country. As months turned into years, ammunition shortages, losses of armored vehicles and drones, and even the inability to provide basic medical supplies dealt a direct blow to Putin's image as an invincible leader. The collection of refrigerators, motorcycles, blankets, and even drinking water from the people in poor areas, and the forcing of university students in large cities to weave camouflage nets in exchange for tuition credits, led to questions about the state's military capacity. While Western media outlets have documented Russia's bottleneck in high-tech weapon systems and spare parts crisis due to Western sanctions, images leaked on social media have spread rapidly among the public, despite the Kremlin's strict control mechanisms. Once seen as the guarantor of stability and order, Putin now faces criticism as a leader who cannot even equip his own army. This erosion of his image is narrowing the Kremlin's room for maneuver in domestic politics. As the living standards of the people are rapidly declining, the financial burden of the war is increasing day by day. Although this situation does not directly translate into victory for Ukraine, it does create a significant strategic advantage. Disruptions in the logistics chain on the front lines are eroding the Russian army's ability to carry out planned offensives and defenses. Ammunition supplies are delayed, armored units are immobilized while waiting for spare parts, and health and ammunition depots behind the front lines cannot be adequately supplied. The shortfall in the Kremlin's war budget is raising questions about its ability to finance long-term operations. This is buying Ukraine time and giving it the opportunity to use military and financial aid from the West in a more planned and effective manner. The Kremlin now has two remaining weapons: fear and the currency. Fear is fueled by tightened laws, police pressure, detentions, and long prison sentences, while the currency is temporarily managed by the central bank's reflex to print money. But both tools are like time bombs. The more fear is suppressed, the greater the pressure builds within society. The ruble's printed fuel inflation, and the money in people's pockets rapidly loses value. State television may say that everything is under control, but the empty shelves in supermarkets and constantly changing price tags send a clear message to citizens on the street: out of control. Air raid sirens have become a psychological barometer measuring the country's mood. Each alarm sounds like a hammer blow, eroding the ruble further and adding new cracks to the wall of people's patience. The fear fueled by the Kremlin's stick policy is backfiring like a chemical reaction. History has shown this cycle many times. In 1993, Yeltsin built fear by attacking parliament with tanks. But when the economy collapsed, that fear evaporated. Today, the economy is already evaporating, so the life of fear is much shorter. Russian history books contain the phrase, "The Russian uprising is a powerful phenomenon." But the picture for 2025, rather than whispering its meaning, screams it out loud. Bread is expensive, children are in the grave, the ruble is worthless, and drone sirens can be heard day and night. And past examples clearly show the outcome of this formula. In 1905, the first revolutionary uprising was suppressed with blood, but 12 years later, the empire collapsed. In 1989, the human chain of the Baltic peoples was isolated, but 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. Today, that chain is being rebuilt in any square with the screams of a mother, the rebellion of a soldier fleeing the front lines, and the rumble of hunger. The only difference this time is that the chain is breaking faster than ever before in history. What do you think about this? Your thoughts are very important to us, so please leave your comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. The increase in rail sabotage and drone attacks between May and July has been linked to a single target: to break the logistics backbone stretching from Zaporizhia to Crimea and from there to Volgograd. This route supplies oxygen to the Russian army's southern front. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, air defense missiles, motor oil. All these resources flow along the railway tracks. Bridges and piers are key points. The Kerch Strait is like the heart valve of Russia's logistics artery, stretching from Zaporizhia to Volgograd. In fact, Rostov and Volgograd are the rear bases. Crimea serves as an advanced depot and distribution area. Ukraine dismantled this network with drone, artillery and missile attacks carried out between May and July. Kiev's troops initiated the offensive by targeting railway tracks. They continued by setting warehouses ablaze. By blocking the bridge, they further intensified the pressure. Now the chain's integrity has been broken. Every kilometer of the railway line stretching from southern Ukraine to Volgograd has become a risk for Russia. Convoys carrying military vehicles and ammunition from Crimea or Rostov to the Ukrainian front lines have slowed down on the railway lines for the Russian army. The waiting time for trains has increased. In other words, Russia's traction plans have collapsed. The backup lines are now overloaded. The Crimean garrisons can no longer keep up with their supply schedules. Air defense ammunition has reached a critically low level. S-300 and S-400 batteries have been forced to prioritize stock control. The locations of Russian radars have changed. Underdome protection has been increased. However, Russia's route change has created new vulnerabilities. Let's now examine the situation more clearly on the map. Volgograd is the hub where cargo arriving from the north is distributed to the southern military district. The refinery and railway area is an important gathering place. From here, heavy traffic flows toward the Rostov axis. The Rostov-Don line is the main junction of the Iron Ring. The Taganrog and Novocherkassk branches diverge from here. This branch carries tonnage toward Crimea and the Azov coast. The Taman and Kerch lines provide direct access to Crimea. The peninsula's inner backbone is supplied via Jankoy. Sevastopol and Gvardiskoy receive their share from here. The second backbone follows the Azov coastline along the coastal strip. Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol, Jankoy. This route forms a land bridge along the coast. In the second year of the war, this route was restored to operational status. However, the risk factor was high. The range was short. Since Ukraine offers a wealth of suitable targets for FPVs and MLRS, these routes have become much more dangerous for Russia today. The third flow advances toward Taman via the Krasnodar Plain. Roadways and secondary railways come into play here. This branch is a critical supplement for the Russian army's fuel and dry cargo. When these three main lines work together, Crimea breathes. If one stumbles, the others take on the load. If all three are under pressure, the system grinds to a halt. This is what has been happening in recent months. The Tokmak-Melitopol sector has been disrupted on the tracks. Security closures have been imposed multiple times on the Kerch Strait. Fuel depots and refinery components around Krasnodar have been hit by drone attacks. The tracks and station areas around Volgograd and Rostov have come under pressure. The result is quite clear. The modular warehouse system in Crimea is operating in a disorganized manner. When the line stops, distribution is interrupted. Even if trucks are used to compensate within the peninsula, the quantity is insufficient. Railways can transport much more tonnage in the same amount of time. When bridges and ferries are closed, entry capacity drops dramatically. Trains wait. Convoys form queues. The supply schedule within Crimea is disrupted. The amount of military supplies delivered to the front lines for the Russian army decreases. As a result, Russian military units face a daily shortage of ammunition. Air defense munitions are the most critical items. Because they are heavy, transporting such air defense components by wheeled vehicles is inefficient. Therefore, air defense systems are dependent on railways. Even if stockpiles are high,
consumption can surge suddenly. A single night of intense attacks could consume dozens of missiles. Such a pace can only be sustained with a robust logistics system. When logistics falter, battery commanders reduce firing authority. Instead of salvos, single shots are fired at soft targets. The interception range is narrowed. Low-priority targets are removed from radar screens. This increases the likelihood of penetration. In other words, a supply crisis directly affects air defense effectiveness. This is the picture in Crimea over the past few weeks. Radars belonging to the Russian army have been relocated on the peninsula. S-400 and S-500 systems, among others, have been deployed to the most secret areas of Crimea. The reason for this is to prevent such air defense systems from becoming obvious targets. However, this makes the Crimean Peninsula an open target for drone and missile attacks. Nevertheless, batteries are constantly being hidden on the peninsula. Camouflage is increasing, but the debate over stockpiles continues. As the intensity of fire decreases, the Ukrainian army advances deeper into Crimea. This time, the targets are not railways but refineries and depots. The areas around Sochi and Krasnodar are examples of this. A fuel terminal is on fire, a pumping station is out of commission. This does not only affect civilian flights, it also delays military fuel shipments to Crimea. The depot balance is disrupted, train loading is delayed, the wagon schedule is disrupted. If there are restrictions in Kerch, waiting times increase, as the Crimean bridge has been closed to traffic for a long time due to Ukrainian drone and missile attacks on the peninsula. When the bridge closes, the flow to Jankoy also decreases on the same day. Backup storage tanks within the peninsula are activated. However, this is not sustainable while the bridge is closed. For this reason, the Russian side attempts to compensate from different directions. From Volgograd to Rostov, from Rostov to Taganrog, and from Taganrog to Tarman. From there to Kerch and alternatively to the Mariupol corridor, or via Yeysk to the Black Sea coast, or in small ferries in pieces. All of these have been tried. However, all of these routes are monitored. Ukrainians use satellites to continuously track Russian logistics decisions. Similarly, ELINT, open source intelligence, and field agents monitor changes along these logistics routes. Low-cost reconnaissance drones can also perform the same task. The narrow bottlenecks along the route are clearly marked on the map. Bridges, station junctions, transformer stations, refinery exits, wagon parking areas, viaducts, all these points have either been struck or are under threat of attack. Therefore, travel plans are updated at short intervals. Trains typically operate at night due to such risky conditions. Convoys attempt to use off-road routes. Wagons are divided into smaller sections, but the risk does not disappear. Because the source of the risk is fixed. Crimea is no longer the rear. The peninsula is now the frontline logistics hub. Therefore, constant fire pressure on the convoy is expected. This situation creates considerable tension among Russian troops. The garrison commander puts evacuation plans on the table. Land and sea exit schedules are prepared for families. Civilian traffic increases around Sevastopol and Simferopol. Queues grow around Kerch. When the bridge closes, panic grows. Trains stop. Ferries stop. Security checks take longer. The cargo that should be transported in a day may take 3 days. Meanwhile, Ukraine finds new opportunities for a new wave of attacks. Even when the rail repairs are completed, successive attacks disrupt the flow again. The supply chain is forced to operate in a catch-and-release mode. This is unsustainable for Russia, because consumption on the ground is constant or increasing. Artillery ammunition is not just bullets. Gunpowder cartridges, fuses, propellant charges, all are packaged separately. Their distribution requires separate tracking. An air defense missile is not just a body. It requires a module for radar guidance. In logistics, these packages must move together. If a single component fails, the entire round cannot be fired. Therefore, partial supply is also ineffective. At this point, the importance of the Volgograd hub increases. Volgograd is not a single source, but it is a threshold point for the Russian southern network. Any disruption here ripples down like a wave. A fire at a station results in a queue in Kerch 2 days later. An electrical failure at a transfer site causes delays in Jankoy 3 days later. If a refinery goes offline, fuel distribution within the peninsula tightens a week later.
Alternative solutions exist but are costly. Dependence on rail transport is therefore unbreakable. It is impossible to transport the same volume by truck. Road transport is risky and time-consuming. Convoys are easier targets. At this stage, transferring ammunition allocated for air defense to the region becomes even more challenging. S-400 missiles and supporting elements are heavy. Breaking the supply line to forward depots around Jankoy and Gvardeyskoye without railways is inefficient. Therefore, commanders withdraw the batteries. Silos are repositioned. Radars are relocated to safer areas. These moves increase the chances of survival. However, they create gaps in coverage. When gaps open up, Ukraine attempts more complex attacks. USVs are deployed for coastal approaches. FPV is deployed via USVs. The most recent example of this was when Ukraine struck a Russian fast attack craft, 3 radars, and a highly classified radar station on Petri Mountain using unmanned drone boats. In such an attack, radar and communication nodes are targeted. Security perimeters are established around bridges within the same night. Small warehouses along the Black Sea coast are targeted. This cycle further complicates supply chains. On one side, fuel reserves dwindle. On the other, air defense munitions are rationed. Thirdly, motor oil and spare parts allocated to armored units are delayed. The field commander compiles a priority list. Air defense moves to the top of the list. Artillery drops to second place. Armored maintenance remains third. This list changes the rhythm of the battle. Fire intensity decreases. Air superiority weakens. Forward units return more frequently for resupply. This return movement creates new targets. Convoys become visible within range. This vicious cycle undermines the morale of the Crimean garrison. Families feel this. Some leave the peninsula. Some wait, but the sense of security weakens. Civilian vehicles form long queues around the bridge. Local authorities redirect traffic. However, military transport must also use the same route. Civilian congestion slows down military movement. This means further delays for the troops. The Russian leadership applies pressure to stay put, but the reality on the ground does not change. The perception of risk spreads along the entire line. Every node from Volgograd to Crimea is under simultaneous pressure. Ukraine achieves this using low-cost platforms. FPV, RAM-type kamikaze drones, long-range drones, cruise missiles, all of these form a chain of strikes. The first wave depletes radar and air defense munitions. The second wave stops railways and bridges. The third wave targets fuel depots. The fourth wave targets command and communication centers. This model can be executed in a single night. It can also be spread over 3 days. Whatever defense measure is taken to stop one step, the next step still works, because the goal is to disrupt the flow. When the flow is disrupted, the front line shakes days later. This delay amplifies the effect. When ammunition begins to run low on the front lines, the air defense shield weakens. When it weakens, a new window of opportunity for attack opens. Thus, the supply crisis turns into a military crisis. Now let's return to the Zaporizhzhia corridor. Transporting cargo between Tokmak and Melitopol is no longer safe. Even if the railway is repaired, a new attack is expected. The Russian side tries alternatives. Land convoys, coastal road transport, night movements, camouflaged wagons, and electronic jamming are among the options. However, Ukraine expands its sensor network in response. Field reconnaissance and signal intelligence are combined. Civilian videos are matched with satellite imagery. Social media feeds are monitored. The clues obtained are turned into targets. This allows for striking small but critical nodes. A cutting area, a station-based transformer, a track repair convoy. All of these create delays in the overall flow. When delays accumulate, logistical capacity decreases. This decline is directly felt on the peninsula. The number of days in storage decreases. The situation is similar for air power. If the delivery of aircraft parts and ammunition to air bases in Crimea is delayed, the sortie rate decreases. Aircraft are deployed further back. S-300 and S-400 batteries cannot hold the airspace alone. If radars remain stationary, the risk increases. If they are relocated, coverage decreases. This is a dilemma for Russia. Ukraine exacerbates this dilemma with a deep offensive. The movement of Russian troops within the area is restricted. Command cannot maneuver. The bridge closes at the moment of attack. Trains and ferries stop. No heavy cargo can pass during this time. This is a planned shutdown. At the same time, a rail disruption is created along the Azov coast. Thus, two-way access is blocked on the same night. The next day, cargo piles up. Before the pile can be cleared, a new attack arrives. This cycle intensified throughout the summer. Now Crimea's logistics routes are under constant stress. The Volgograd and Rostov centers cannot absorb this stress alone, because the attack range has extended to these centers.
Fires around the station, hits on warehouses, explosions around the refinery, all of these have also targeted the rear area. For this reason, the Russian army begins to push its stocks backward rather than forward. This reduces the daily share of the front line. On the battlefield, this situation manifests as a decrease in fire intensity. Counter-battery fire becomes less frequent, long-range interdiction decreases, more targets pass at low altitudes. This opens the door to new strikes. This situation reflects as a loss of morale among the troops. Families perceive greater risk. Evacuation requests increase. Russian commanders attempt to limit these requests. However, they cannot completely stop civilian movement. Each new bridge closure amplifies anxiety. Queues appear on screens. This image undermines the narrative of security behind the front lines. Propaganda cannot conceal this. Because the flow is real-time, the number of waiting vehicles is visible, and cargo on the tracks is photographed. The strategic outcome is as follows. The logistics artery stretching from Zaporizhia to Crimea and from there to Volgograd is under simultaneous pressure. Classic compensation mechanisms are insufficient. New distribution schemes are costly and fragile. Crimea is now condemned to a state of constant alert in the short term. In the medium term, the balance of ammunition and fuel is even more fragile. In the long term, even if the garrison on the peninsula remains numerically intact, its effectiveness will decline. Because the logistics rhythm has been disrupted, the supply flow is intermittent and every new attack resets the planning. The only thing that can change this reality is permanent security in logistics depth. This is not possible under current conditions. Even if air defense ammunition is sufficient, transportation issues prevent it from reaching the front lines in meaningful quantities. Even if transportation is sufficient, fuel shortages prevent it from reaching the battlefield. Even if fuel is available, bridge closures prevent it from reaching the peninsula. Within this framework, the combat power of the Crimean garrison gradually weakens. Russian command sees this. Hiding, relocating, fortifying, night movements. The Russian army tries all of these, but every solution creates a new problem. That's why panic waves continue. The peninsula is no longer a secure rear area. This assessment is not the result of propaganda, but of the logistics math on the ground. Every new disruption on the Zaporizhia front sharpens this math. Every closure on the Kerch Strait accelerates this math. Every fire around Volgograd and Rostov pushes this math deeper. The troops remaining in Crimea feel this every day. The load decreases, waiting increases, the route lengthens, the risk grows, and as long as this picture does not change, the outcome will not change either. From Russia's perspective, holding on to Crimea becomes more difficult. Even supplying the peninsula becomes nearly impossible for Putin. Forget about waging war from Crimea. The waving of blue and yellow flags in the peninsula is now being discussed. This is the exact situation we are in right now. In other words, Ukrainians have effectively surrounded Crimea from within through small but constant and strategic attacks, infiltration operations, and partisan movements, and have begun to control the railway logistics artery connecting Zaporizhia to the peninsula and from there to Volgograd. The most tragicomic aspect of this situation is that while Russian citizens living in Crimea are fully aware of these developments, the Kremlin and its allied class dismiss them as insignificant and choose to ignore them. Thank you for watching.
Russia's financial backbone has always been oil and natural gas. It finances the war, keeps the economy afloat, and buys support at home and abroad. But now this foundation is shaking. In July 2025, the Russian Ministry of Finance announced that only $9.8 billion had been collected in energy revenues. This represents a 27% drop compared to a year ago. Such a significant decline in a single quarter is not just a numerical drop, but a strategic collapse. Is this decline due to sanctions or Ukraine's targeted attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure? Of course, both the long-term pressure of Western sanctions and Ukraine's increasingly sophisticated attack strategies are behind this decline, but one of these two factors has been particularly prominent in recent times. Ukraine's high-precision operations, carried out with unmanned aerial vehicles. Kyiv is now targeting not only the front lines, but also Russia's energy arteries in its heart. July 2025 marks a period of intensified attacks. Ukrainian forces dealt successive blows to Russia's vital oil and natural gas infrastructure with drones, and this chain of blows continued unabated in the first days of August. On the morning of August 2nd, a series of powerful explosions were recorded in the Volgograd region in southern Russia. This was not just a local incident. Its repercussions were felt throughout the entire Russian defense industry. The explosions directly targeted the Central Asian Central Natural Gas Pipeline, which stretches from Turkmenistan through Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to Russia, and supplies the energy needs of the military-industrial complex. This pipeline is not just an ordinary energy corridor. It is a strategic lifeline feeding Russia's heavy industry backbone. Following the attack, production at key facilities supplied by the pipeline came to a near standstill. With the disruption of energy flows, the production complex of the Russian aircraft manufacturer MiG, the Demikovsky machine building plant, and the Magnum K factory, a critical site for ammunition production, have suspended operations. These are not ordinary businesses. They are production hubs forming the backbone of the Kremlin's war economy. In other words, this attack targeted not only the infrastructure, but also Putin's economic lungs, which supply ammunition and vehicles directly to the front lines. And right now, those lungs are unable to breathe. The Central Asian Pipeline is the center of a multinational system controlled by Gazprom that supplies gas directly to Moscow's internal industrial regions. This pipeline transports natural gas from Turkmenistan to production centers in Russia, such as Tambov, Saratov, and Voronezh, keeping metal processing furnaces, foundries, radar electronics facilities, and nuclear fuel preparation laboratories in operation. But now this flow has been suspended indefinitely. Expert teams are assessing the damage on site. But initial reports clearly indicate that this is not a simple pipe crack or valve failure. What is being reported is widespread and deep structural damage to the main artery of the system. In other words, this is not a simple malfunction, but a kind of systemic shock. However, Russia's misfortunes did not end there. On the same night, 3 simultaneous drone attacks were carried out at 3 different locations under the coordination of the Ukrainian security service. A base where Shahid-type kamikaze drones were stored in Krasnodar was targeted, while the strategic facility Elektroprilad in Penza, which houses electronic warfare infrastructure, was also hit. At the same time, the Novokuybashevsky oil refinery in Samara was also on fire. Located just 19 kilometers outside the city center of Samara, this facility is one of Russia's largest and most critical refineries. The fuel produced here is pumped into export pipelines, sent to military fuel depots, and forms the basis of regional logistics. The facility, which is subject to US sanctions, was engulfed in a large fire after being hit. Following the attack, Samara Airport was closed to flights, and mobile internet was cut off in the area. Firefighters began emergency response efforts to protect Rosneft's remaining assets. 2 of the 3 reactor groups in the CDU-VDU line, which has a daily processing capacity of 200,000 barrels of crude oil, were shut down. The damage, which cannot be repaired within a week, is estimated to cost Rosneft $32 million in daily revenue. Not only local production, but also fuel flows to Black Sea ports via the Volga Basin have decreased by 10%. The diversion of RZD freight trains operating in the same corridor to secondary routes for diesel refueling is directly affecting the speed of artillery and ammunition convoys advancing toward the front. In the medium term, this logistical pressure will reduce the supply frequency to the Zaporizhzhia-Donetsk front. Let's move on to the events of August 3. A high-precision drone attack carried out by Ukraine targeted one of Russia's most strategic oil storage facilities on the Black Sea coast, located in the Adler region near Syrskyi. A huge fuel tank containing 2,000 cubic meters of aviation fuel caught fire in the attack. The massive column of flames that rose with the explosion covered the sky just a few kilometers away from Syrskyi International Airport. The smoke cloud observed was so dense that it could be seen with the naked eye from kilometers away. This attack did not only cause infrastructure damage, it also sent a direct message to the Kremlin on a psychological and symbolic level. This is because the facility that was hit was one of the central storage sites of Kubanefta, a state-owned energy giant. Given its location, the strike on this facility, which is a critical link in the aviation fuel supply chain for Syrskyi International Airport, represents a major blow to military logistics in the southern corridor. Furthermore, this attack was aimed at the heart of the propaganda narrative built around the myth that Russia is safe inside its borders. Local authorities tried to downplay the explosions with the usual rhetoric, saying they were secondary fires caused by captured drone parts. But images shared on social media painted a different picture. Simultaneous columns of flames rising from two separate points, and direct hits on the target. In other words, this incident was neither a technical malfunction nor an uncontrolled chain of coincidences. On the contrary, it was a sabotage operation carried out with surgical precision. Following the attack, 127 firefighters and more than 30 vehicles were dispatched to extinguish the fire. But the explosion of a tank of this size did not cause only physical damage. Syrskyi airport was closed to flights for about 2 hours. Neither incoming nor outgoing flights could take off or land. The chaos caused a domino effect in the civil aviation infrastructure, albeit for a short time. And what is even more striking is that this was not the first attack in Adler. On July 24th, Ukrainian drones targeted the Lukoil Ugnefta product depot near Adler, causing serious fires. The fact that the same area was hit again just 10 days later indicates that Kiev is systematically targeting southern fuel routes. The symbolic value of Syrskyi goes beyond its military or logistical importance. It was the stage where Putin transformed the 2014 Winter Olympics into his international showcase. It was presented as an untouchable zone, where the Kremlin sought to polish the image of modern Russia, where foreign dignitaries were hosted, and where the Russian elite vacationed. But on the night of August 3rd, the reality behind this ostentatious showcase went up in flames. It was a moment when war stripped away all the glitz and directly destroyed the myth of Putin's secure rear front. But what really made this collapse visible was not a military report or a government statement. It was a few seconds of reality captured on young people's cell phones. Karina Oshchurakova, who lives in Syrskyi, picked up her phone after the explosion and shared the rising flames on social media. The images quickly spread across social networks. Contrary to the official propaganda shrouded in silence, these images showed how vulnerable the rear front actually was. And the result was not long in coming. Russian authorities detained Karina, initiated administrative proceedings against her, and fined her 30,000 rubles, or about $375. Moreover, they tried to discredit her in court with allegations that she had been drinking and was unable to assess the situation properly. But it was too late. The video had spread as fast as the fire. The Kremlin's narrative of backward immunity collapsed not only with exploding tanks, but also with a 30-second video. The Russian business magazine OSINT presented striking data on the damage caused by these attacks. The attacks may have reduced fuel production by 40,000 tons per day. This figure is large enough to shake both the market and the Ministry of Energy. So what is Moscow's solution? The usual reflex: turn off the tap. The Kremlin has once again resorted to its well-rehearsed response to economic turmoil. With a decree that came into force on July 30th, Russia suspended most of its gasoline exports for at least 2 months. The reason is clear: to prevent prices from skyrocketing in the domestic market and to prevent panic buying and local shortages. But this decision is nothing more than carrying water to a fire. Analysts say that the Kremlin's reflex to protect the domestic market cannot hide the collapse of its actual production capacity. In particular, the partial shutdown of the Ryazan refinery and the complete shutdown of the Novokuyabishevsky refinery are further upsetting the balance at a time when supply is already insufficient. The decree is valid until the end of September for now. But with the fire raging inside, closing the door to the outside is not a solution, only a delayed crisis. As the Kremlin clings to its export ban, the real problem is its inability to produce. Empty tankers are a sign that not only the ports are emptying, but also the war economy. All this pressure aside, the Kremlin's budget was already 3.7 trillion rubles in deficit in the 8th month of 2025. This is a precipice almost unheard of in the history of Russian finance during non-war periods. Military spending is climbing, energy revenues are falling, the ruble is losing value, but the war is becoming even more expensive. Moscow's coffers are rapidly emptying. Behind this financial erosion are not only Ukrainian drones or sabotage attacks, but also the transformed form of sanctions. The new oil price cap, introduced by the European Union in the summer of 2025, is deeply cutting into Russia's margins on the global market. While the old price cap system set fixed limits, the new system is flexible. For each oil shipment, the Russia price is fixed at 15% below the market price. In short, even if prices rise, Russia always lags behind. They earn a little less per barrel. With each ship departure, a little more blood is drawn from the budget. This system does not directly ban exports, but it is a slow, systematic strangulation. The Kremlin continues to pump oil, but it is pumping volume, not profit. Value is being quietly sucked out. And then came another blow, this time from across the ocean. The Donald Trump administration began imposing a 25% tariff on India. On the surface, it may appear to be a routine trade war maneuver, but it is actually a strategic move aimed directly at Russia's energy lifeline. Russia accounts for approximately 40% of India's crude oil imports. Delhi has been Moscow's largest customer since 2022. After losing the European market, this is the Kremlin's main customer. But if India does not want to shoulder this customs burden, or slows down its purchases from Russia under pressure from Washington, the Kremlin's last major stronghold in energy exports could fall. This would not be a loss, but a collapse. Moreover, it is not so easy to fill India's place. China has already secured large discounts. Turkey can only make limited purchases. Southeast Asian countries have insufficient refining capacity. Europe has already closed its doors. In this equation, the Kremlin no longer even has time to look for new buyers. But the war demands more resources. But the economy can now offer less. The fronts are expanding, the need for ammunition is increasing, and human resources are insufficient. But the Kremlin's coffers can no longer keep up with these demands. Sanctions do not blow up tanks, but they slowly wipe out the fuel for the tanks, the gunpowder for the cannons, and the salaries of the army. Their effects are not chaotic, they are debilitating. They are silent, but persistent. A war machine does not necessarily have to be destroyed. It is enough for it to be exhausted, and that is exactly what is happening. Russia can still produce, sell, and even use weapons. But the real cost of these weapons is approaching a point where it can no longer be met. Every bullet, every missile, every drone attack now burns not only a target, but also an item in the budget. Oil used to be the antidote to every crisis. Now even its price is not enough. It is no longer a question of getting rich, but of survival. The financial foundation that once provided unlimited support for Putin's war is now slipping away from under his feet, step by step. The state coffers can no longer buy weapons, let alone time. And winter is coming. The Kremlin does not have the resources to change the course of the war, but it cannot afford to lose. Caught in this dilemma, Moscow may suffer a heavier blow in the coming weeks, not in a military war, but in an economic one. Because every war is lost first with numbers, then with cities, then with fronts. Now that first stage is nearing completion. What are your thoughts on these developments? How do you think Russia's economic deadlock will affect the war? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. We will continue to share new developments with you as they emerge. Until next time, stay safe.